And I want to welcome and thank all of you in this meaningful engagement. This is going to be my third engagement that I have with Pastor Mike. I particularly selected him in this particular enterprise because I believe that he's probably one of the most articulate people that I've come across, although he's new in the field of apologetics. So I thoroughly enjoyed the last two sessions we had with him. And I thought that for a meaningful engagement on this particular topic, in the South African context, he would be ideal for purposes of this presentation. Now, I like to move around when I talk, but I've been told by the cameraman that I have to stick in one place. So unlike Potchefstroom, where we just simply walked up and down the particular aisle, I may have to just stick at this particular point and try and engage you in the best of my capability with the limited resources I've got. Of course, I would like to have been up there with him, but unfortunately, because of the presentation and the connection, I'm down here. Now, here's a question. Does religion lead to terrorism? That's the issue we are basically focusing on tonight. Because you see, recently we've got, particularly in the international context in London, in parts of the United Kingdom, certainly in other parts of the world, you've got attacks, sometimes by individuals who are purportedly acting in the name of religion, and in other instances you've got people who are basically acting in the name of some kind of political philosophy, whether it's right-wing ideology or whether it's in fact something which motivates them to engage in this kind of violence. But the question we're focusing on tonight is, does religion lead to terrorism? Now, here's the point. Karen Armstrong, she wrote a book called The Killing Field. What was it called? Fields of Blood. We both read it. Fields of Blood. I was going to say The Killing Fields. That's actually Cambodia. But it's actually called The Fields of Blood. And in the introduction, she says that the general consensus seems to be that when it comes to violence, people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and so on, they seem to give the argument that monotheistic faiths have led to more violence in history than any other single ideology. That's a general consensus today if you look at the secular world. In your country, there's someone called Bill Maher. You heard of him? Never heard of him. Well, he's got a show. He's a talk show, the Bill Maher Show.
Yes, heard of him.
Of course you heard of him. And he's an atheist, atheist secularist. He regularly gets Sam Harris, a well-known atheist. And this is the kind of propaganda that is put forth throughout the world by these individuals wanting to basically punish religion. And I think it's important that us religious communities, both Muslims and Christians, that we effectively come together, take a step back and see what are in fact some of the motivations behind the violence that we see in the world today. Now I'll give you a classic example here. World War I, was that a religious war? World War II, was that a religious war? The Crimean War, the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge. If you know who the Khmer Rouge were, they rose in the context of Cambodia under Pol Pot. The Falklands War, the Mao's genocide, Stalinism, the Third Reich. We've got some of the most bloodiest acts of violence and wars committed in the 20th century, and of course now moving to the 21st century. And we need to ask, are these wars, are these acts of violence motivated by religion? Collectively speaking, the amount of deaths that have resulted in the 20th and 21st century by secular ideology far exceed the deaths that have been caused by religious violence for more than a millennium. And I'm talking about the Crusades, and you look at the wars between Islam and Christianity in history, this far exceeds that. So how, by any stretch of the imagination, can anyone then come to the idea or argument that it's in fact religion that has led to more bloodshed than any other ideology in history? Can you see that the premise at the outset doesn't in fact make sense? I've got another individual here, Mark Sageman. This man is a psychiatrist, a 61-year-old born Polish psychiatrist. He was a former CIA operations officer that was based in Pakistan in the late 1980s. He worked closely with the Afghan Mujahideen. After 9/11, he was part of the Department of Counterterrorism, testified in the 9/11 Commission report, and authored numerous books, as you can see there. And an interview was conducted between him and a renowned journalist called Mahdi Hassan as to whether the violence that you see being performed by these so-called individuals today in the world, even those who are acting in the name of Islam, whether it's in fact any form of justification within the religious worldview. And this is what he said. He said religion has a role, but it's a role of justification. It's not why they do this or why young people go there. And in the context of ISIS, for example, which is a topical issue, ISIS members, he says, are using religion to advance a political vision rather than using politics to advance a religious vision. And so to give them some degree of legitimacy, they use Islam as a justification. And he goes on to say it's not about religion, it's about identity. You identify with your victims. The guy's been killed by your enemies. This is another individual, Ali Sufan. He wrote a book called The Black Banners, the inside story of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. And he conducted interviews with a lot of people that were either part of terrorist cells and also had left the terrorist cells. And when he began interviewing them, this is what he said. He said, when I began interrogating Al-Qaeda members, I found that they could quote bin Laden's sayings by heart, but I knew far more of the Quran than they did. And in fact, some barely knew classical Arabic, the language of both the Hadith and the Quran. He says, far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not in fact practice their faith regularly. He says, many lack religious literature and could in many instances be regarded as religious novices. And that's quite telling, because the assumption that people sometimes have is that these individuals are somehow or the other knowledgeable about their faith, acting upon their faith, and of course engaging in violence in the name of the faith. I'll give you one example. This man here, you've probably seen him. He is nicknamed Jihadi John, after John Lennon, somehow because he's from Britain, so they call him Jihadi John. Real name, Muhammad Amwazi. He was an ex-rapper. And he subsequently joined this movement called ISIS. When they looked at his background, when they analyzed his background, that's MI5, the intelligence that looked at his background, they found that he was raised and educated in the United Kingdom. He was described by two British medics who met him at a Syrian hospital as quiet but a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And he had drinking expeditions in Africa with a German friend of his before immediately joining ISIS. Now the question we need to ask is, why is it that those who do not exhibit any form of religiosity in fact end up in these particular extremist movements, like Umar Mateen? You heard of Umar Mateen in the Florida bomber, the gay nightclub in Florida, in the United States, last year. You heard of him? Yeah, Umar Mateen. When they looked at his background, he purportedly shouted out Allahu Akbar before shooting down the particular clubbers and revelers that attended that gay nightclub. The story goes, the Daily Mail, a United Kingdom newspaper, did an investigation in him, and they found that prior to this attack, he was found to be engaging in gay orgies with a Costa Rican boyfriend of his, who was purportedly HIV positive. Now this basically goes to show that the type of motivation behind these individuals are sometimes more than basically what meets the eye. There were two other individuals, Muhammad Ahmed and Yusuf Sarwar, two young British men from Birmingham. They were convicted of terrorism charges in 2014 after traveling to fight in Syria. And when they looked at their computers and access to the sites that they were using to study, they found that they bought books called Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. Now, this is a very basic, elementary, you've got, like, for example, the Bible for Dummies or Islam for Dummies. You can find them at Adams Campus Bookshop or Exclusive, whatever the case is. But the elementary, for people who have no knowledge of their faith, you're going to buy those particular books. This basically asks, what then were the motivation behind these individuals? In 2008, a classified briefing note on radicalization, it was prepared by MI5's behavioral science unit. MI5, that's the equivalent of CIA, MI5, James Bond, you've all heard of him. And the Guardian newspaper, they obtained the report by MI5, and they made the following observation, that's in the report itself. Far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy. Many could be regarded as religious novices. And the MI5 analysis went on to say that a disproportionate number of the converts who basically adopted this faith and engaged in acts of extremism, they had a high propensity for drug taking, drinking alcohol, and visiting prostitutes. That's quite amazing. How are they then viewed as the ideal? Because in the right-wing media, in the right-wing press, these people are are basically viewed as normative. I mean, if you look at people like, if you've heard of them, Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Daniel Pipes, all these kind of right-wing ideologues who want to give the idea that Islam is inherently violent, they would cite these individuals as being normative. And in certain missionary circles as well, they would use this as an argument against Islam. It says a well-established religious identity actually protects against violent radicalization. Here's another individual, David Kenner. He writes for the Washington Journal. He wrote for Foreign Policy magazine. He also did interviews on these individuals that were arrested. Some of them were shipped off to Guantanamo Bay and so on. And this is the assessment that he made. He says, none of them appear to be particularly religious. Not once did conversation turn to matters of faith. And none budged from their seats when the call to prayer sounded. Like here, most of you heard the call to prayer. Most of us went there, and some of you joined us. They appear driven by anger, humiliations, big and small. And it's more that motivated them, as opposed to a detailed exegesis of religious texts. Now, here's another individual. This individual here was the recent Manchester bomber, Salman Abedi. And this is an article from The Observer, which gives a detailed background of his account. And when you look at the background, when you look at the lifestyle that this individual had, it was in no way epitomized a religious lifestyle. And so the basic question then, how is it then that people just suddenly, the talk is that he went, he listened to somebody, and then suddenly he became radicalized. But strangely enough, he was on the MI5 radar for months. His father was part of a group whom they called the Manchester Boys. The Manchester Boys was the Libyan armed Islamic fighting group that was being used by the British government to depose Gaddafi when Gaddafi was deposed in 2011. And this was obviously his son. But the point is that this man was on the radar of MI5. He didn't in any sense exhibit any form of religious tendencies. And you see that his lifestyle didn't in fact show or illustrate that this is someone that is in any way motivated by their faith. Now, a lot of these people claim, or may make the claim, that they're engaging in acts of jihad, but in reality, what you see is something else. This individual here, Quran Bhatt, a year ago, if you go onto YouTube, you type a link called The Jihadi Next Door. Channel 4 did a documentary on him. The same, just go onto YouTube tonight, type in The Jihadi Next Door. There's a YouTube documentary on him and his group. And you basically see, so these are individuals that are known, these are individuals that people are aware of, and somehow or the other we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we allow these terrorist acts sometimes are being made to happen? And then of course we've got the introduction of the curtailing of civil society. I'll leave you with this individual here. This is the famous 9/11 hijacker. His girlfriend was Caucasian, well, American, white, and when she was interviewed, she described his lifestyle. And not surprisingly, when they were doing checks and balances on these individuals that were involved in the 9/11 attacks, they were finding Qurans everywhere. They were finding Qurans in nightclubs, Qurans in strip clubs, and yet these individuals here, apparently the talk is that he relished pork chops, strip clubs, hard liquor, drugs, and gambling excursions. The other radical Muslim hijackers led similar lifestyles. And so, the night before 9/11, the talk is they got drunk in a bar and left an alcohol-soaked Quran on their table. That's what the story goes. There's another individual, if you guys are familiar with him, arrested for soliciting prostitutes. So these are not the individuals that are at the core of Islamic religiosity. And if they're not, then how can we say that when they engage in acts of violence, that their violence is somehow representative of their faith? Can you see? Because this is the assumption people have, that it's certain Muslims that are engaging in acts of violence, and that their violence is somehow representative of their faith, and that this is in fact normative, or a normative value system that they are basically exhibiting. Of course, you have, in certain contexts, people are in fact fighting legitimately for their struggle to independence and so on. But here was another report by Robert Pape. He wrote a book, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and I'll leave you with this point on this particular issue. He analyzed suicide attacks between 1980 and 2000, and this is the conclusion. He says, the data shows there's little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism. Rather, what nearly all suicide terrorist acts have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal. And that is basically to regain what they call their particular land that has been effectively occupied, certainly in the context of the occupation and the wars that you see in different parts of the world. And so it's important then that we move away from the kind of agenda that the extreme right would like us to believe. As believing communities, both Muslims and Christians, we need to garner the best that our faiths basically have on offer. And we need to utilize them in building and reshaping and remolding and creating a meaningful, holistic community where we live with each other, where we embrace each other, and where we use the ethical paradigm within our faith to basically live out justice and decency, where we view each other as decent human beings and moral citizens to which other people can then basically follow. So, none of these people, those on the top, you know who they are. Okay. No one thinks that those people are representative of the Christian faith, am I correct? So why do many people think that those on the bottom are representative of the Christian faith? Is that a decent question to ask? So, that is an Islamic organization, ISIS, about as much as that is a Christian organization. Or if you look at people like Pablo Escobar, the drug dealer in Mexico, he wears crosses and he engages in mass murder. And he basically is a regular churchgoer and contributes to the church. Nobody says that he's representative of his particular faith. So how do we basically deal with the issues that we have here? Is there any justification within our faith that leads to any degree of violence? Well, in the last debate we had, it was a debate, this is a dialogue tonight, and I'm going to focus more particularly on Islam. When we analyze any faith, you need to look at the text and you need to look at the context. And my argument is that it is the intertextual and contextual interpretation of passages of Scripture which will in fact lead you to the eternal message that is basically promoted by that particular book. Now, I seem to have left I've got a little booklet here that I've basically just made a certain note on. If you look at the Quran itself, peace, the word for peace is as-salam. That is one of the 99 attributes of God. In Surah 6, verse 126, in relation to paradise, it says, surely this is the path of your Lord. Straight have we detailed the verses for those who take heed. For them is the abode of peace. Paradise is described as an abode of peace. In Surah 10, verse 25, you read, and Allah, God, calls you to the abode of peace and leads whom He wills to the straight path, which is penultimately the goal of humanity. When war becomes inevitable, we are told in the Quran, وَإِنْ جَنَحُوا لِلسِّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ هُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. If they incline to peace in the context of warfare, those who attack you, you also incline to it and put your trust in Allah, for verily He is the hearer of the all-knowing. Surah 4, verse 19. So if they withdraw from you and fight not against you and offer you peace, then God has opened no way for you against them. So Islam embraces or accepts a just war theory when war in fact becomes inevitable. But it takes into account the fact that if those who are attacking you decide to take a back step and refrain from any hostilities, and you yourself are not to engage in any form of aggressive hostilities. Peace viewed is the cornerstone of Islam. For example, you heard the Imam when he was basically making what we would call the supplication. There was a portion where he was addressing everybody, and there was a portion where he was supplicating the dua in Arabic. And sometimes you have the dua, for example, made, the supplication, something like this. Allahumma anta salam. O Lord, you are peace. Wa minka salam. All peace proceeds from you. Wa ilayka ya'udu salam. Help us to live in peace. Wadkhilna al-jannata dar salam. And allow us to enter paradise, which is your lodge, the lodge of peace. So can you see that the emphasis of peace is paramount within the Islamic worldview? In fact, the word Islam, one of the derivative meanings of the word Islam, obviously coming from Islam, but also salam, is peace. And so a description of Islam could be viewed as peace acquired through surrendering your will to the will of God. a definition of Islam. Here's another passage in the Quran which Mike would probably be familiar with. Surah 2 verse 208. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا ادْخُلُوا فِي السِّلْمِ كَافَّةً وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. Oh, you believe, the word is silm. Enter absolutely into silm. The word is silm, not Islam. Enter into peace completely. Do not follow in the footsteps of Satan. He is an outright enemy of you. So how do you enter into peace? And if Islam is generally scapegoated and typecast as inherently violent, then I'm not putting this as a challenge, but in a kind of a contradistinction form. Is there any other religious book on earth which says, oh, you have faith, or you have accepted faith, enter into peace completely? How do you enter into peace completely? How do you establish a relationship with God based on peace? So based on that, we would argue that no one can be compelled to live by Islamic morals. It's only God who guides people to the right way, and that's related in the following verse in Surah 2 verse 256. Let there be no compulsion in religion, for truth stands out distinct from falsehood. La ikraha fid-din, qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy. So in other words, the age-old myth that was spread out by all the Orientalists, Islam was spread by the sword. You know, the classic Orientalist imagery that you see about a Muslim soldier on his horse, with a sword in his hand and the Quran in his other hand, ready to go and convert the world by the force or duress, by the edge of the sword. Well, that is totally debunked in the Quranic text, because the Quran says that you cannot compel someone by means of faith. Now, does this mean that there was no violence in Islamic history? Of course not. Of course there was violence, as there was violence in Christian history. And more often than not, you see the violence that you see writ large was by and large the accumulation of land, the seeking of wealth, and people somehow or the other were in fact religious, purportedly religious in their worldview. Here's another verse of the Quran in Arabic. I'll read it out. It says, لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ جَعَلْنَا مَنْسَكًا نَاسِكُوهُ فَلَا يُنَازِعُنَّكَ فِي الْأَمْرِ وَادْعُ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ إِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ هُدًى مُسْتَقِيمٍ. By the way, Arabic is similar to Hebrew, so it shouldn't sound foreign. If you're familiar to Hebrew, they're sister languages. Basically, what this verse is saying, that to every people out there, we have given ways, rites, and ceremonies which they must follow. We have given them rites and ceremonies which they must follow. And it tells you, do not interfere with them, but summons them. Call them to the way of thy Lord, in humility and peace, for thou art assuredly on the right way. So there's no compulsion. Nobody can compel someone to force their faith. Otherwise, it's an exercise in hypocrisy, because even on the assumption that you can, or you're allowed to convert someone to their faith, what happens if I hold a gun to you and say, accept Islam or accept Christianity, and you just simply accept it by means of pronouncing from your lips? Do I change your heart? No, I don't. So how can you, by stretch of the imagination, believe that anyone could be converted by means of force? And so Thomas Carlyle, the great English philosopher, stated that it's only a fool who would think that someone could realistically be converted by means of force. Another passage in the Quran, Surah 28, verse 56, you cannot compel those who you'd like to Islam, but God guides those whom He wills. He has best knowledge of the guided. Surah 25, verse 63. The worshippers of the All-Merciful are they who tread gently upon the earth, and when the ignorant address them, they reply, peace, salam. Can you see that? Surah 2, verse 177. In doing good to others, it is not righteousness that you turn your faces towards the east or the west. But truly righteousness is he who believes in God and the last day and the angels and the books and the prophets. And more importantly, spends his money for the love of Him, for the love of who? Of God. And on the kindred, and the orphans, and the needy, and the wayfarer, and those lost for charity, and for the liberating of slaves. Now, does this mean that slavery was eradicated in the Islamic world? No. But that was the ideal. But the fact that certain Muslims may have, for example, engaged in slavery, does not in any way make it an Islamic enterprise, in the same way as the Atlantic slave trade would not by any means make it necessarily a Christian slave trade. You get the point? And so it's important that when we analyze faith, we need to let our scriptures talk for themselves. We need to go back to the root. For the Muslim, the ultimate route, and you want to adopt the position of sola scriptura, as I believe my friend Mike would, you'd have to go back, in his case, to the Bible. In the case of a Muslim, you would have to go back at the primary level to the Quran. That would be the fact or the means in terms of how we define the faith of the individual. Now you heard this term, and I know time is running out. I haven't kept too much time, but I believe that you'll have the same time as I do. So if I go, but we're not really debating tonight. We may debate in the future. Most of you have heard the term jihad. Have you? And I assume that that immediately triggers certain connotations in people's minds. And one of the common connotations and myths that people have is holy war. Now, war can never be holy. So to call jihad holy war is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Rather, why not look at the root term of the word jihad or jahada, which in its root sense simply means to struggle. Now, how do we struggle? There are different forms of struggles in life. For example, non-violent struggling within oneself for a life of virtue. That is described as a jihad. Internally, you're struggling against your own passions, your desires. Saying the truth, speaking out, even if it's against one's own interests. So if you have a country like this here, and you see corruption and all forms of poverty and injustice, you stand up and speak against your leaders. And of course, the third form is combating. When combat and fighting becomes necessity to defend your land, and we'll look at some of the verses, that can also be a type of jihad. But can you see that sometimes what happens is that item number C is amplified, and that is viewed as jihad, holy war. When in reality, when you look at the text of the Quran, it tells you something entirely different. So, I'll give you one example of these verses of the Quran, which in fact deal with the issues of fighting. One of the verses, we've dealt with this before, and I deal with this numerous times. Surah 2, verse 190. وَقَاتِلُوا قَاتَلَ to fight. وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Fighting God's cause against those who wage war against you. Because bear in mind that the Quran was revealed in when? The 6th century. This was a society which was primitive, a society where sanguinary warfare was the order of the day. So when people fight you, when people engage in genocide, when there were no limits to what people did, what are you going to do in that context? So the Quran says, when it deals with the issue of fighting God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not commit aggression. For verily, God does not love the aggressors, and if they desist from fighting you, behold, God is much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. Can you see? Muhammad Aslam, as a beautiful commentary I'm going to give Pastor Mike, a noted Quranic commentator, states that that verse lays down unequivocally that only self-defense, in the wider sense of the word, makes war permissible for Muslims. And in the past 10 years, I've challenged people, and I'm not talking about you, this is not a challenge to you, but people that I deal with, sometimes hostile, both inside and outside my faith, give me something contrary to that, which in fact allows the permissibility of warfare. And so one can go on to say that jihad means a physical effort to exert, to be close to God. The Quran uses the term jihad generically. We can go into that during the question and answer session or the discussion period. And you can see that the word is used generically for both Muslims and non-Muslims. Like, for example, the word Khalif. You've heard of the Caliph. When you think about the Caliph, what are you thinking about? Think about some Islamic leader. But in actual fact, the word in Arabic is Khilafah, vicegerent. And do you know who is described as the first Khilafah in the Quran? Adam. So man, in fact, is the vicegerent on earth. Again, it's used generically. A book which you may be interested in looking, Shattering the Myth, Islam Beyond Violence, by Bruce B. Lawrence. He said jihad has relevance in modern society, provided it is shorn of the connotation of violence and is informed by a moral purpose, that is justice for the underprivileged. Jihad has come to mean the advocacy of social justice in an increasingly widening circle, that also includes economic participation and prosperity for Muslims, and the modern context, not just for Muslims alone. So for example, if I come across like the anti-globalization movement, or Greenpeace, or environmentalists, all engaging in acts of struggle to protect, save the environment, save the needy, Medicine Sans Frontier, Gift of the Givers, and so on. That is in fact an act of jihad, a struggle with establishing or combating against injustice that you see in the world. The Arabic word for war is harb. In fact, the word for holy war in Arabic is al-harb al-muqaddasatu, holy war. That's non-existent in the Quran, it is non-existent in the Hadith literature. And so the term itself is non-existent. War is repeated 36 times in the Quran, peace is repeated 67 times in the Quran. Can you see the emphases in terms of where you find that? Do Muslims love war? Well, the Prophet Muhammad stated that the worst name is war. And when war became inevitable, these were some of his combat instructions. Never kill innocent people. Never torture prisoners of war. Never kill animals. Never destroy crops. Never destroy infrastructure. Never mutilate bodies of enemies, dead or alive. Houses of worship, women, children, and elderly are protected from harm. Always bury the dead with respect. And this was 1400 years prior to the Geneva Convention. So challenge this, or find something contrary to this. Surah 4 verse 36. Worship God and associate and show kindness to parents and to kindred and to orphans and the needy and to the neighbor that is a kinsman and the neighbor that is a stranger. Now obviously this doesn't mean your neighbor is necessarily a Muslim. It could be anyone from any other faith. And the companion by your side and the wayfarer, surely Allah loves the not the proud and the boastful. Now I'm going to skip all of these issues here. I'll probably just end with last. Surah 60%. God forbids you not with regard to those who do not fight you on account of your faith, nor did they drive you out of your homes, that you may deal justly and kindly with them, for God loves those who are indeed prone to justice. Now, does anyone in all these verses that I've had have any difficulty? I mean, you don't have to accept it that this is now from God. I'm not asking you to do that. But from a purely human level, could you have any difficulty with accepting the principle that is essentially exhibited in these particular verses? I don't think you can. I really do not think you can. And so, it's important the other passages that we can probably deal with, Surah 9, Surah 9 verse 29 and so on, which maybe in the rebuttal or the discussion that we may possibly have. But I'll just leave you with this, and I think I may have, have you been following my time?
Not at all.
Not at all. Well, where's our chairman dispute to? Do I have 6 minutes left? Okay, I thought I had, are you sure? I was just not keeping too much in contact with time. There was a French journalist by the name of Didier Francois. Those of you who were in Potchefstroom, I think a lot of you were there, may have probably seen this slide. He was kept in captivity by ISIS for a period of 10 months before being released in 2015. He then did an interview with a lady called Christiane Amanpour, the journalist from CNN. And so he was asked, one of the questions he was asked was, were these individuals in fact motivated by religious fervor and faith? Now hear this up, because there are going to be a lot of people out there that may be dressing in Islamic garb, that may be purportedly shouting out, Allahu Akbar, or whatever the case is, and not know anything. But when he was questioned, this is a man who spent 10 months in captivity. This is what he said. He said they didn't even have the Quran. A lot of these people that were there. He said there was never really a discussion about text. They said it was not a religious discussion. It was more a political discussion. And he concluded by saying it's more hammering what they were believing than teaching us about the Quran. That's where his statement closes. And I go and add, actually the inverted comma should be after the word Quran, because in fact it has nothing to do with the Quran. Lee Ross, in 1977, he coined a phrase called fundamental attribution error. And that refers to the phenomenon in which we place excessive emphasis on internal motivations to explain the behavior of others in any given situation, rather than considering relevant external factors. Like a woman in a domestically violent relationship. You know, many women in domestically violent relationships blame themselves and say that it's their fault, it's not the fault. Maybe there's something in he's depressed or he's sad. And so, when questioned whether he sees religion as a useful analytical prism through which you can view the rise, for example, of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the radicalization of all these particular groups, his response was no. And so it's important that when we look at anything in the world, we take a step back and we effectively, basically, go to the root sources of our faiths. There is a lot in common between both Christianity and Islam. There are certainly fundamental differences as well. But I'll give you one example and I'll leave you with this, just to show the affinity between our faiths. Islam is the only non-Christian faith which makes it an article of faith for its followers to believe in Jesus. Did you know that? No Muslim is a Muslim if he doesn't believe in Jesus. The Jews who follow the Old Testament, the Tanakh, they don't believe in Jesus. They reject him as a false prophet. And yet, Christians should be closer linked to Muslims who accept the prophet and personality of Christ as opposed to Jewish individuals. We believe, for example, in his miraculous birth, which many modern-day Christians like the bishops of the Anglican Church reject. We believe that he performed many mighty miracles. We believe that he gave life to the dead, at least from the Quranic point of view, by God's permission, and that he healed those born blind and the lepers by God's permission. And the only real difference, or the parting of the ways, is which we say he's not God Almighty in human form, not in God incarnate, and not the begotten Son of God. But in the broader sense, we are basically going toe-to-toe in terms of respecting the personality of Christ. And if that is indeed the case on these issues, and that the only kind of differences are purely limited to certain theological evidence, the divinity of Christ, maybe that could argue as the kind of primary division. If that's the only kind of difference, then what stops us? Muslims, 2 billion Christians, although some of you may not view Catholics as Christians, but a large number of Christians, approximately 1.7 billion Muslims. There are about 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. What prevents us from coming together and living on a platform of respect and mutual harmony with each other? We can have our differences. These differences have been gone on from time immemorial. Nobody's going to change that. I don't know if Jesus is going to change that in his second coming. But these have gone on from time immemorial. There's nothing we're going to do to change it. But what we can do is learn to respect each other, learn to understand each other, and allow us to speak for our own faiths, allow our faiths to speak for themselves. Therefore, one of the reasons, one of the motivations for me getting Mike here is I wanted him to share from his perspective how his faith defines him, as opposed to me defining it for him. I think in the world today, Muslims and certainly Islam deserves that element of respect in terms of which it allows itself to define itself and not allows external factors or individuals out there with certain vested interests and modus operandi and their own particular agendas. And so I thank you for that. I thank you for attending this program. And I hope we can have future sessions in the near future. I believe Pastor Mike is going to call me soon to his seminary, and we're going to have further discussions. It's good that we can talk to each other, because in lots of parts of the world, this kind of interaction just simply doesn't happen. And I think that's our privilege. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, everybody. May I greet you in the name of my Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So happy to be here. I want to say right off the bat, I've been accepted in many a church over the year, and I've experienced great hospitality in many Christian settings. And that being said, tonight you, as the Islamic community, this local community, the Muslims here, have accepted us with no less hospitality. And I really do appreciate it. This, I can tell you, myself, my church, several other people that we've invited to come, we've been very excited, praying a lot for this event. You guys have been awesome. Thank you for the gifts. You prepared several bags for us. This is a book that I gave to Yusuf during the first debate. And this is now the second edition. As he mentioned tonight, it's a little fatter. The first one I wrote in 2 weeks in preparation for that debate, and we've had a little more time to do a better job, I hope. Now, that being said, I'm going to make an apology. The printer was a bit rushed and made a mistake on the back, so there's a line that was left off of the back. If you notice that, I didn't mean to leave that sentence halfway through. But this book I'm going to leave with Yusuf, and we have brought several of them, as you can see on the table. They are free. Please feel free to take one. The name of the book is These Sayings Are Faithful and True. They are the answers to Dr. Shabir Ali's 101 Contradictions in the Bible. So if you're interested in that, I don't care if you're Muslim, Christian, or otherwise tonight, please feel free to help yourself. We've brought along, I believe, plenty of books for that. Now, Yusuf, I thought it'd be interesting tonight. I thought about it. I don't think we're going to do it, but I thought it'd be interesting if you and I would just switch places. And if I defended the Islamic position, if you defended the Christian, wouldn't that be interesting? To see if we know each other's arguments well enough that we could just flip-flop for a while. Of course, we're not going to do that. But I am going to challenge Yusuf just now. I'm not using the Quran that you gave me. He gave me as a gift last time, Yusuf Ali's translation. I'm going to read from Pickthall's translation. I want him to tell me if he can spot this verse. Tonight we're discussing, right, religion, is it a source of violence, correct? So I'm going to read this verse, and you folks now please hold on to your chairs, a little bit of a jolt here. You tell me if this sounds peaceful. I read, and this is God speaking. Therefore will I number you to the sword, and you shall all bow down to the slaughter. Because when I called, you didn't answer. When I spake, you did not hear. But you did evil before my eyes, and you did not choose that thing in which I delighted. Can you tell me which verse that is?
The book of Isaiah.
He's right. Well done. I've read Isaiah chapter 65 and verse number 12. I had it, it is in the Quran. I stuck it in there before we started. Now, most of you, as you read this, if you're the typical inhabitant of society, the typical citizen, we learn about religion mainly from Facebook, coffee cups, and headlines from various news outlets. And that's the extent of our knowledge of both Islam and Christianity. And I must admit, I'm a product of my society. When I first was invited to do this debate, I began to study tremendously in preparation for it. And I won't kid you tonight, I learned so much in such a short amount of time. My respect for the Islamic faith grew immensely. As he's mentioned tonight, this doesn't mean that I agree with Islam. I'll be upfront about that. I say that with respect. I don't agree with Islam on many, many points. That being said, Yusuf and I talk well. We get on well. I believe we could say that we're friends. And this event tonight goes a long way to proving you don't have to agree on every point, even some very important points, to treat each other with respect. When it comes to this matter of religion, is it a source of violence? I don't need to give you one more minute of any sort of information, no slides, nothing. You know the answer to that is yes. Religion can be and has been a source of violence for a long, long time. And I believe that within the Islamic community, if you study its history, study the Quran itself, there are many issues when it comes to violence that need to be dealt with. There are many things in the hadith, in the tafsir, in the Quran that I would raise questions with and would like answers to. That being said, I have listened to a number of Christian apologists and polemicists. Yusuf, you've debated some of them. And I'm one of these kind of guys. I do not want to just listen to what that guy says and say, he's on my team, he must be right. That Christian guy, man, he laid out all these hadith and tafsir, and he laid out the sharia, he laid out the verses, and looky there. Looky there. That must be how Islam is, because he's a Christian, he's on my side, must be telling the truth. I'm not that kind of guy. I'm going to take what he says and go research it. Go read it for myself. And Yusuf, I'll tell you tonight, what they usually throw at you, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 48, chapter 4, I've gone through personally after every one of his debates and studied them all out, and I came to the conclusion that I did not agree with the Christian apologists. Now, that being said, I didn't always agree with what you had said about it either, but I must admit that a lot of the information that gets given on this topic, it comes from a bias and prejudice standpoint. And that's too bad. That is too bad. Now, I believe if I can address the Christian crowd for a moment, you remember in Matthew 7, and I say that, maybe many of you Muslims might be familiar with this as well. Matthew 7, Jesus spoke of, he said, do not judge, lest you be judged. And he says, before you judge someone, you better take the beam out of your own eye, right? He says, you're going to take the mote out of somebody else's eye, take the beam out of your own eye first. So tonight, rather than go through and give you what could be violent, and I believe, as I mentioned, there are issues within Islam that need to be dealt with. But before I go picking that mote out, and can I be honest, there's a beam in both of our eyes. And I say our religious faith, our faith. We need to deal with some questions. But before I go digging, looking for that beam in his, I'll go for the beam in mine. So I'd like to address you on the biblical viewpoint of religion and how it's a source of violence, how it gets twisted to be one. And I'm going to start off in John chapter 18 and verse number 36. And that will be my jumping off place. And we're reading here of a time when Jesus has been arrested and he went through a mock trial with the Jewish leaders. And now he's been taken to Pilate. Pilate has been informed that Jesus is supposedly the king of the Jews. And then Pilate begins to ask him, is that true? Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus in his response said this, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Now, it's going to be very difficult in the next 20 some odd minutes to try to address all the violence in the Bible. And maybe you as a Christian came here tonight expecting and hoping that I would pull out my biblical hammer and just pound on Yusuf for a while. And like I said, I don't believe that I have the right to do that. Because if you read the Quran, and I have, and study it, and I have, and then you read the Bible, you're going to find out there's a lot more violence in the Bible than in the Quran. Now that may not sit well with some Christians in the room. I'm sorry. Truth hurts, but it's a fact. So until we deal with it from our angle, from where we sit, it's very difficult for us to turn to any Muslim and say, hey, why does your religion have violence in it? When they open up our book and go, and what about you? It's an issue. So what do we do with it? Jesus has a lot to say in one verse on this. My kingdom is not of this world, he says. Now, we'll deal with that in just a moment, a little more in just a moment. He says, if my kingdom were of this world. Please notice the if, great big if. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. Can I deal with another thing that a lot of Christians often say in this sort of setting or in a debate setting? That it's difficult to defend it. They say Jesus is nothing but peace. Prince of Peace. 100% peace, peace, 100%. And while he was on the earth, yes, he did. His teachings, I believe, are second to none for creating peace and peacemakers. Love your enemy. Pray for them that spitefully use you. If somebody were to come and attack us as Christians living now in this day and try to take our faith from us using the sword, we are not permitted to fight back, but to pray for them, bless them, and so forth. I believe second to none. Jesus is teaching on that. There is definitely that peaceful aspect. The book of Isaiah chapter 53, it was prophesied that Jesus would be buried with the rich in his death, which he was, and that he would do no violence. And he fulfilled that prophecy. But to say that Jesus, the biblical Jesus, is only the Prince of Peace, massive mistake. You cannot, I cannot, as a Bible-believing Christian, catch what I said, a Bible-believing Christian. Some other denominations might put their spin on it, but as a Bible-believing Christian, I cannot defend the position that Jesus is only a man of peace. So how do you say that? Well, there's a lot of different verses I could show, but this is one of them. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. So I believe that tells me something. I can now look through the Bible, and I'll be able to divide it. The Bible says that we must rightly divide it. So I'm going to use this verse to rightly divide the word of truth. I'm going to look in the Bible at when God's servants fought, physical battles, using swords, and so forth. And you're going to find, wherever you see that violence being perpetrated by God's servants, you're going to find God's kingdom on this earth. And we'll deal with it in just a moment in the Old Testament. And if we want to stretch it out further, we can talk about it now. When Jesus comes back, Revelation chapter 19 portrays Jesus as wearing a white robe dipped in blood. It says in Revelation 19, I believe it's verse 10 or 11 right now, verse 11, 12 somewhere, that he doth judge and make war. Jesus, Prince of Peace. The Lamb, right? John the Baptist. Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world. Amen, I like that. Revelation 6, Jesus is coming back, and the people cry out and say, let the mountains fall on us and hide us from the face of the Lamb. We're afraid of the day of his wrath. So let's be balanced. Yusuf, I've heard you cry for it many times. Even scales, even scales. I'm going to try my best to even them up tonight. Let's own up to it, folks. I mean, the Bible it talks about violence. Let's deal with it. Now, on both sides of this, when Jesus comes back, the book of Revelation, it's very clear, Battle of Armageddon, not hundreds, not millions. The Bible talks about over at least billions will die during what we in the Bible know as the time of the tribulation. Not all of that is a direct act of God. Some of this is natural disasters and so forth. But at the Battle of Armageddon, hundreds of thousands will die. That's what we read prophesied, if we believe what we read. Now, how do we explain this? What do we do with that? This is Jesus coming back to establish a political kingdom wherein he is the ruler of it, King of kings, Lord of lords, and he rules over everything on this earth for 1,000 years. That's the biblical layout for that. Now, anytime we deal with a political government, we must allow for physical violence. Are there any of you in this room tonight that has a problem with the South African, this nation of South Africa having a military? No. If it's used properly, we thank God for it. No nation is going to be put down or set aside because they have a military. So when we're dealing with a political setup, a government watching over and having dominion over a piece of land, you're going to find violence at some stage. We all want to avoid it. Jesus wants to avoid it, and we'll talk more about that and how he tried to avoid it. What about the Old Testament? In the book of Exodus, God called his people Israel out of Egypt. This is agreed upon in both the Bible and the Quran. As the people marched out of Egypt, they are no longer just a few tribesmen, clansmen. They are now a nation, millions, walking out of Egypt. And God says, you're going to go to the promised land, which also we find, Quran, Bible. God gave them a piece of land, and as he called them out, he said, here's these plagues I'm going to throw at Pharaoh. And then he drowns Pharaoh and his armies in the sea, violence. The firstborn die in Egypt, violence. He brings them out marching through the wilderness. And then he says, as you go towards Canaan, violence. You guys remember the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Girgashites, all the ites, the Cellulites, all of them fighting. When you go into the land, there's going to be blood shed everywhere. How do we deal with that? The common Christian answer is to say, well, that was then, this is now. That's the Old Testament, this is the New Testament. We don't believe in that. And all of a sudden, it's almost as if we're saying, take the Old Testament, throw it away. That's not a biblical perspective, because over 80% of the New Testament is quoting the Old. So we can't do that. Furthermore, I believe that Jesus is God. I believe that. As he said, this is one of our fundamental differences, but I believe that. So let me be consistent in that. If I say Jesus is God, many Muslims have brought this up to me. If Jesus is God, and you say Jesus is peaceful, then what about the Old Testament? Wasn't that Jesus commanding the conquest of Canaan and the utter destruction of those tribes? And the answer is yes. Yes. Exodus 15:3, the Lord is a man of war. Revelation 19, he doth judge and make war. Does that sound consistent? That's consistent. What I find in Jesus is not just one thing, but many, many virtues. Peace, yes, also righteousness. I also find complete holiness. I also find mercy. I find a very balanced God when I speak of the God of the Bible. So when I go to the Old Testament, how do we deal with these atrocities? If I can show you the verses in the Quran, aim for their necks, cut off their hands. I can paint the picture. But wait a minute. Go read Joshua 6:21. Go read Deuteronomy. Go read Numbers. Slay them with the sword. I read you the verse from Isaiah. Bow down to the slaughter because you didn't choose what I liked. How do we deal with these things? Let me give you just a quick list because time is of a premium. Number one, when it comes to dealing with the conquest of Canaan, let me point this out right off the bat. That was an exceptional case. You must make a distinction. When God said, go utterly destroy them, that is not what God told Israel to do to all the nations of the world. God never told Israel, you're going to propagate the religion, the Jewish faith, with a sword. Never. Never. He didn't say, go conquer the world in the name of Jehovah with this sword. Never. So take that idea out of your mind. It was an exceptional case. Those nations, those people groups living in the land of Canaan and in their nearby areas, they had been warned. They knew this was coming. And when God said utterly destroy, it applied to only those people at that time. It was limited. We must realize that. But then, okay, fine, let's limit it. But is it still okay to utterly destroy entire people groups? Genocides. Kill everything that breathes. Women, children, dogs, cats, camels, donkey, everything? Let's deal with that. Number one, God is extremely long-suffering. Well, I should say number two in this case. He's extremely long-suffering. We read in the book of Genesis that the Amorites, their iniquity was not yet full. And God was giving them at least 400 years. A lot of people just say 400. More than that. More than that. So how do you know? Have you read Sodom and Gomorrah? Everybody in this room, Muslim and Christian alike, we agree on this, that God punished the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah by raining down fire from heaven. Yes? Am I right on that? Okay. Sodom and Gomorrah, if you look on the map, just look for the Dead Sea. That's Sodom and Gomorrah. They were neighbors with the Canaanites, Hivites, Girgashites, and so forth. So the things that the Sodomites were doing, the other people in that land were familiar with and also to a certain extent guilty of. God waited not just 400 years, but 400 years from the time He told that to Abraham. So God is extremely long-suffering. Number two, God is righteous. He must exact punishment. You can't let people do what they were doing and get away with it. The Bible says in Genesis 13 about the Sodomites, they were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. If we are to be consistent and say God is righteous and holy, then we expect Him to take action at some point. He must punish them for what they're doing. Fourthly, when it comes to genocide, this exceptional case of it, so many people think that was the first thing God said. Israel, come out of Egypt. All right, you see those guys up there in the north? Go kill them. We're painting a very skewed picture there. You know what God told them? I'll go through this quickly. Exodus 23. You're going to go to that land. I'm going to send hornets before you to run the people out of the land. Drive them out. I'm not going to do it in one day. I'm going to do it little by little so that the land doesn't get overgrown and so forth. Little by little. God gently pushing the people out. Why? He doesn't want to exterminate them. He wants to push them out. Say, go live if you want to do that, fine, go do it, but don't do it in my land. So that was God's first plan. Numbers 33, which happens a little bit later. God says, then ye shall drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you. So God says, I'll drive them out using hornets. Step two, you get to the land, you drive them out. You drive them out. And when you drive them out, destroy their pictures, their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places. Why? Don't want spiritual corruption. And then the next step, Deuteronomy 7. They said, oh, Lord, we've checked out the land of Canaan. There's giants there. Them folks are big. How are we going to whoop them? And Moses says, guys, remember the God that brought you out of Egypt is the God that's going to bring you into Canaan. Don't forget that He's able to step in and help. Furthermore, if you need more hornets, He'll send them. Deuteronomy 7. And you try to push them out, drive them out, say, please leave, get out of here. And if they don't want to go, He says, okay, then we have no choice, time to take out your swords. But I see in that it wasn't God's first option, just run in and start committing genocide. Why is this okay? I would say part of the reason is God was concerned about spiritual corruption. If these people are allowed to continue in their ways, living in the land amongst the Israelites, they would corrupt Israel. And by corrupting Israel, God would have to rain down punishment on Israel and thereby destroying the people he loves. His nation whom he called out of Egypt. And he wanted to avoid that. And I believe God is vindicated in that concern because the Israelites were disobedient, left some of the inhabitants alive, and they got spiritually corrupted. So God was right. God was right. Now let me be very careful here. If any nation in the world today tries to say, oh, well, then to avoid spiritual corruption, we will just say, if you teach anything opposite from me, you're going to die. The only one that's allowed to make that law about spiritual corruption is God himself. And when I look back in the Old Testament, I am satisfied that God proved he was the one doing the work amongst Israel. He was the one that brought them out of Egypt. Though there were miraculous signs, even in the Quran, this is spoken of, that God gave clear signs to Moses for Pharaoh and so forth and brought them out. So I see with no doubt that it was God making these laws. No man is allowed to do that, but God can. Furthermore, if I can just throw this in quickly, in Surah 71, verse number 26 and 27, Noah said, my Lord, leave not of the unbelievers a single one on the earth, for if thou dost leave any of them, they will but mislead thy devotees, and they will breed none but wicked, ungrateful ones. You know what Noah was praying for to Allah? He was saying, don't leave anyone alive, because if you do, they're going to grow up, they're going to breed more, and they're going to lead the right people away. They're going to lead your devotees down the wrong path. It was a prevention for spiritual corruption. So I see both biblically and Quranically, this is a valid reason to do this. I've already touched on this, but another thing that makes this, if we can, I don't want to say make it, let's say makes it understandable, is Israel was given a piece of land. They were not, it was not a command to go and kill everybody that disagrees with you. Here's this piece of land, and here's some laws to govern that piece of land. Now, if you want to talk about other nations coming from a very far distance, there were a different set of rules for how to deal with it. It wasn't utter destruction. Very different set of rules. So let's be sure we keep that in its context. Moving forward, we know that Israel did get established in the land. Eventually, they did fall into spiritual corruption. God took away their kingdom. All throughout the prophets, Isaiah and forward, you read over and over, God is going to send the Messiah. And he is going to do two things. When the Messiah comes, he has to deal with two aspects, the spiritual and the physical. He must deal with your sin problem. And then, if you get that first thing right, we'll deal with the kingdom problem. So when Jesus showed up, there's two things he's trying to do. Number one, first of all, let's deal with the sin problem. Thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. When Jesus began to preach, he said, repent, for the kingdom is at hand. Two parts. Repent. Get it spiritually right. If you repent, if you get it right with God, then we'll discuss the kingdom. We know what the Jews did. They rejected their Messiah. They did not want to repent. And thus Jesus stands before Pilate and says, if my kingdom was of this world, then we'd fight. But it's not. Why? They rejected it. So as we move into the book of Acts, we read in Acts chapter 1, before Jesus went back to heaven. In verse number 6, Peter and the other apostles said, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? Fully expecting that the Messiah, now that he has bled and died, as the Old Testament prophesied, Daniel chapter 9, the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. It was prophesied that he had to die. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with the stripes we are healed. Jesus fulfilled those things. It says in Isaiah 53, the same passage, he was buried with the rich in his death. He was dead, he died and buried, and he rose again according to what we have in the Bible. And now the apostles say, you've been the suffering servant, now do we get the conquering king? And Jesus said, no, guys, listen, we're not giving you the kingdom now. The Father knows when that's going to be set up, but it's not now. Here's what you're supposed to do. Wait here in Jerusalem. When you receive the Holy Ghost, you'll receive power to be witnesses unto me, unto the uttermost part of the earth. And that's why a Texan is here in South Africa preaching like this. I'm following that verse. I'm to go into the uttermost part of the earth. This isn't the uttermost part, but I think I can see it from here. We're close. We're close. All through the book of Acts, the disciples were persecuted. Never did they pull out of a sword trying to even defend themselves. When they were being put to death, they laid down their lives for the sake of Jesus Christ and His gospel. Paul made it very clear, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Matter of fact, I brought my weapon tonight. You want to see it? No, I'm kidding. Here it is. Paul said in Ephesians 6, verse 17, the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God. Amen. This is my sword. Carry it with me. This is our battle. Not a carnal one, not a physical one, but a spiritual one. This will culminate one day in Jesus coming back and fighting a physical battle. You know why that's okay? It's because He's coming back to establish a political government. He's given us 2,000 years to repent. Long-suffering again. And it's not me starting it. Now, as you go through church history and you get to about the 300s, when you from the time of Jesus and the apostles up until about 300 or so, you find Christians laying down their lives and there was no violence. From a biblical Christianity viewpoint. But then a man named Constantine has some sort of a conversion moment. I doubt it. But that's how the story goes. And as a result of that, politics... Now, Constantine was the emperor of Rome. Now he says, hey, I'm a Christian. His version thereof. Long story short, he mixed politics and religion. Bad mistake. The only time that was right is when God mixed politics and religions in the Old Testament. See, the nation of Israel, politics and religion in one. But God set that up. Come to the New Testament, Christians don't have a piece of land to rule over. We're not told to conquer any land. We're told to go out and witness for Jesus Christ and tell everybody how much He loves them and wants to save them and have a personal relationship with them. But Constantine got the two mixed up and he says, now we are Christians and I am the emperor, so now this is a Christian nation, not a biblical thing. Fact of history, but not a biblical thing. From there, it spun out of control. Augustine, in the 400s, that led to Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s saying, it is okay to use coercion, to use compulsion in religion. If somebody doesn't agree with us as the Roman Catholic Church, we are allowed to bend their will a little bit with our sword, with our tortures and so forth. And this is where the Crusades happened and all of this, and we just don't have time to unpack all of that now. But I would see that as a perversion of biblical Christianity, not a representation of it. This was part of what the Reformation was all about. People said, hey, we cannot let this Pope tell us what to believe. We have got to get back to the Bible.
Amen.
I'm going to, just for time's sake, I got 55 seconds. Here goes the fastest gospel sermon you've ever heard. I've got to slip this in. You know, even after the Reformation, did you know that some of the reformers still practiced the church-state setup? Persecution, even under them, even under some Protestants, they still killed people that didn't agree with their version of Christianity. Again, not a biblical thing. I just need to get that out because we're trying to get the beam out of our eye, right? Let's make sure that the Bible remains our final authority. When it comes to jihad, I'm glad you brought this up, Yusuf. Jihad. The greater jihad. How many Christians in here know what that is? The greater jihad. In Islam, there's two versions. There's the greater and the lesser. The greater jihad is not fighting and killing people. The greater jihad is the struggle within. Help me? Nafs, almost. Ekbir. So, don't teach me wrong. My timer went off. Can I finish my point? Is that okay? You give me extra time? Because he took extra time? I didn't count your time, so I don't know if you took extra time. The greater jihad is the inner struggle. Overcoming temptation, sin, lust. I spoke with a Muslim gentleman this morning in our town. And he used to cuss me when I'd walk past. And God got a hold of his heart. He stopped me one day and he said, my friend, it's wrong. Allah does not want me to do that. I should be nice to you. Well, listen to this, and we've got along ever since. I appreciate that. We were chatting, and he said, you know, a long time ago in traffic, I used to get very angry at people. That happens in South Africa. Get angry in traffic. And he said, now I've learned when I'm driving my car, I'm just kind to these people. And now when they cut me in traffic, I roll down my window, and instead of waving something else, I wave my hand and say hello. And I leaned into him and I said, "You're overcoming the greater jihad, aren't you?" And he said, "I'm trying." I said, "You know, the greater jihad is how you handle the traffic. The lesser jihad, which in Islam, that's the wars that you have to fight, civil wars, stuff. That's the lesser jihad. We would say that the lesser jihad is South African traffic. That's the outward battle. The inward battle is how you deal with it." This was in the Bible 600 years, well, let's say 550 before Muhammad mentioned it. James chapter 4, verse 1, "From whence come wars and fightings among you?" Lesser jihad. "Come they not hence, even of your lust that war in your members?" Greater jihad. What I find in the Bible is a wonderful solution for fixing the lesser jihad. Stop the wars. How? Nation against nation. Kingdom against kingdom. How do we stop that? Jesus pointed it out. There's kingdoms, there's cities, there's families, there's individuals. How do we fix a nation? Fix the city. How do you fix the city? Fix the family. How do you fix the family? Fix the individuals in the family. How do we do that? Take them the gospel. According to the Bible, we read that Jesus said this. There were a group of Jews that began to believe on him. He said, "If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." They answered him, "We be Abraham's seed, and were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free?" They thought he was talking about lesser jihad. In verse 34, Jesus answered them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin." Greater jihad. He said the problem is not outside. The problem is not the war and the fighting out there. It's in you. You're not able to overcome your own problems, frustrations, anger, lust. You can't do it. Jesus explained further, "The servant abideth not in the house forever." That is, you're not going to stay in this body forever. One day you will die. "But the Son abideth ever." That is, once you've received Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, this is not just you making a contractual deal with God. This is you beginning a personal relationship where He moves inside and never leaves. And no matter what the temptation is, I have Jesus inside to say, "Don't roll down your window and shout at that guy. Bless him instead. Give him the gospel. Pray for him." Jesus finished that passage by saying, "If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." How do we fix the lesser jihad? The greater jihad is the one we must concentrate on, and the Bible says, "Now thanks be unto God that giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." That's how we overcome that greater jihad. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Yusuf, I have a very important and intriguing question. Who is your favorite rugby team? That's not the question.
Sharks. We'll be the Sharks.
Sharks. Let's go. Well, one of the fundamental differences between Yusuf and myself, I would say, is final authority. We've talked about it before. I am sola scriptura. I go back to the Bible as my sole and final authority. Within Islam, I don't find the same attitude towards the final authority. My opinion now, I see 4 different kinds of Islam. There's the Islam that you see in Muslim countries that are ruled by Islamic rule. Then there's a different sort of Islam, the cousins of this one, but the Islam you'd find in non-Muslim countries like this one. I think they're cousins, they're close, but a little different. And then the third group, I'm shy on this one. I'm going to put the name ISIS out there, but only because they use that name. I agree with what you said earlier. I see ISIS more as a political group that is using religion to justify their cause. But nonetheless, the name is there. And then this 4th kind of Islam is the one that I view, the one I picture in my mind when I read the Quran. And I read the Quran and I think, okay, that's how Islam should be. But then when I look out into the world, I don't see that same Islam. So then we find in certain countries there are some practices that are in doubt. And we have to factor in the hadith and the tafsir and different Muslims, a few different things or a table. So I struggle where I sit. I look at the Quran and I think we should just go by the book, because that's how I do my faith, just by the book. Once we have to factor in, what about this hadith and that? That's, to me, where Islam does. That's where the questions come up. Wow, where is this violence coming from? How can we justify those practices? So maybe you'll help me, help all of us understand what's the right position, what's the right approach toward the hadith, tafsir, all the other things that you might turn to for answers.
Okay. It's an excellent question, Mike, and I think if I could just have I don't think I need the mic itself. I'll just use what I've got attached to me. I think that the basic thrust of the question asked by my good friend here is that he sees different manifestations of Islam. You see the type of Islam that is practiced in Muslim countries. You see the type of Islam that is practiced in a setting like us, where we have Muslims interacting with non-Muslims. And then, of course, you see the type of Islam, or if you could call it that, which is practiced by people or groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, which he quite rightly, and I would applaud him for that, acknowledges as something which is inherently political, morphed into something which is mutated. And then, of course, the fourth aspect, as I understand, is where he questioned the idea of the Quran in relation to the Hadith. Now, how many of you know what the Hadith are? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The rest of you? 6, 7. The rest of you? Never heard of the Hadith. Okay. The Hadith, basically, I think maybe that's a starting point. Maybe when I come to Poch, we could expand on that. The Hadith, in the time of the Prophet, there were things that he would say. Like in the time of Jesus. Jesus would say certain things. It says that Jesus went to a certain place and he preached the gospel. He verbalized certain comments. And so likewise we find that in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there were things that he would say, there were things that he would do, there were actions that he would engage in, which was very much in sync with 6th century Arabia, for example. And these particular actions, attributes, sayings of him would be collected orally and then transmitted from generation to generation. And then in subsequent centuries, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, you'd have people that would basically collate and collect these particular sayings and thereby seem to attribute certain passages or certain aspects of what the Prophet said, what he did, and what he spoke. It's like this, something like Chinese whispers. You know what Chinese whispers are? So Mike says something to me, and then I relate it to him, and then he related to the lady here, and then it goes on until we have a whole line of people, and then eventually that person records what the individual in fact narrated, what Mike narrated. Hadith is very much like that. And so, in accordance with the science of Hadith, there is a stringent test or criteria that is utilized in terms of determining what is authentic and what is inauthentic. Now, this has been very loosely done in Islamic history. And more often than not, you find that the hadiths that we have inherited, so-called attributed sayings, we say that it's a separate collection. You see this here, these are not the words of Muhammad. Even the stylistic rendering is as if God is speaking. For example, he would tell Muhammad, say, O Muhammad, God is one and only. Or, verily, this is part of the revelation, things unseen, which we reveal unto thee, as if God is speaking. But the hadith is what the Prophet allegedly said. And so, there is a separate criteria in determining what is authentic and what is inauthentic. There are a lot of hadiths out there which are inherently inauthentic for the sole reason that they contradict the spirit and the purport of the Quran. And so we would basically reject them. But because the compilers of these particular hadith were viewed with a certain degree of piety, they were viewed as religious holy men, therefore in certain aspects of certain communities, there is a degree of respectability afforded to these particular books. But from an academic, historic point of view, we would analyze these particular sayings and we would contrast them with the Quran, and based on the fact as to whether it conforms with the Quranic text or whether it contradicts with the Quranic text, you either accept it or you do not accept it. So anybody could say, the Prophet said this. Well, did he really say that? Is it now in contradiction with what is contained in the Quran? If it is, how then can you accept it? And can you see, Mike, that is essentially the problem That's basically a product of history. It's very much like, I wouldn't say, you see, in the Gospels, if you look at the Gospels, we as Muslims believe that the Gospel was revealed to Jesus, meaning it's something which God vouchsafed him, gave him revelation. But the Gospels that you have today are biographical accounts about what Jesus did, what Jesus said, and so on. So one could basically argue that just like the Gospel accounts are narratives about what Jesus said and did, the Hadith literature are accounts about what the Prophet did and allegedly said. But there is a test in determining whether that is stringent or not. Now, in certain circles, in certain conservative circles, there may be a great degree of emphasis placed on this particular body of literature. But at the end of the day, when it comes to determining, in other words, to separating the wheat from the chaff, you've got the Quran, and I do believe in sola scriptura. This is essentially the source. This is source material, the reference book in terms of determining what the Prophet did. And there's a hadith, by the way, where the Prophet stated, do not write down anything about what I said, lest it becomes confused and conflated with the Quran. But certainly in Islamic history, people did do that. And through a whole series of oral traditions, you had a person that came, he heard what the Prophet allegedly said, did, and then he compiled it in the form of a book. But that process took centuries later. And so you'd have certain aspects of the hadith which may not be in accordance with the Quran and would basically reject it. Does that basically clarify your position in terms of the hadith vis-a-vis the Quran?
I understand what you've explained here. I still have some questions about it, but I don't want to take away from their time to ask questions. So maybe we. Could
I ask a question based on what you said? Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Generally speaking, I mean, you are now into this field of, you said that you're new into the field of Islamic apologetics and so on. When I've debated some of the people I have debated out there in the world, people like J. Smith, not so much James White, J. Smith, there are people like Osama Dakdok, you've seen the debate a few weeks ago, and Robert Spencer, so on. A lot of these individuals. A lot of them come from the background, which you're very honest about, in terms of which they suggest that they present an image of Christ that is holistically pacifist, which you've clearly corrected. The Mennonites would be one example, who I think the Brethren in Christ and many other groups. But it seems to me that there is a trend, and I want you to perhaps address it and correct it, that there is a trend in modern day Christendom, not amongst general Christians, but particularly those Christians who are engaging in polemics against Islam, that when it comes to, for example, the Old Testament, the usual retort, as you stated, is, I don't follow Deuteronomy, it doesn't bind me. Or Jesus was peaceful, the Prophet Muhammad fought wars. Now, is it your position, and I think this is important to clarify, that when Jesus comes, and when you see the descriptions given in Revelation, for example, about literally coming with a rod of iron and a sword sticking out of his mouth, do you believe that these are metaphors about his return, or do you believe that literally Jesus will come as a belligerent judge and enact judgment and literally destroy his enemies?
Right. That's
okay.
It's a very good question. Do I get started?
Sure.
Right.
It's not my only.
I'll read the scripture. I believe what I read. I'm a literalist. When I say literalist, please understand a passage where Jesus said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. I don't believe Jesus is a physical, literal door. I believe it has a real, literal meaning, that he is the entranceway to salvation and so forth. So I believe the Bible literally, just to set that straight. So that's known. In Revelation 19, I had it correct earlier, verse 11. I saw heaven opened, behold, a white horse. He that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. As I mentioned earlier, just to balance it out, 2,000 years of waiting, giving people opportunities to repent. There's certainly the long-suffering and mercy of God has been manifested. This is not his first option. He doesn't just come and knock people down for not believing. He's trying, he's waiting. But yes, I believe literally, he does come, he judges, he makes war, he does it in righteousness. The people that are going to receive these punishments have earned it. We read this in many other places. In verse number 12, his eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. He has a name written, and no man knew that he himself, his vestures dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God, which you'll find that in the Quran as well. Interestingly enough, this morning, just in my daily devotions, I read the sister passage to that. This is what gave me the idea to ask that. How did you get that from Isaiah earlier? That was well done. I really thought I'd get you that. Well done. But in Isaiah chapter 63, who is this that cometh from Edom, with dyed garments from Bozrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, travailing in the greatness of his strength. And then the answer comes. It's like a news reporter. Who is this that's coming from Edom and coming with these garments? And he answers, I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Jesus answered. Verse 2, wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? This is Revelation 16, where he stomps on the enemies and the blood rises up. I believe it means what it says. Verse 3, the answer, I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me. So his enemies, of course, did not repent at that time. For I will tread them in my anger, and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. This, the Scripture interprets the Scripture. Isaiah 63, it expounds on Revelation 19 and vice versa. I find it very interesting, the next verse. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. So God waits. There's a due time for these judgments. Just like it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. God gave mankind warning before bringing down the judgments in Noah's day. Likewise now, not just 120 years, almost 2,000. You know what's interesting about this? A couple chapters before it. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Who said that? Who read that in the New Testament? It's Jesus. Jesus read this in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4. It goes on to say, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. That is where, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus closed the book, handed it back to the rabbi, and walked out. But let me read you the next part of verse 2. And the day of vengeance of our God. That's the next part. It's a comfort all that mourn. As I mentioned earlier, when Jesus came, he came for two things. Number one, deal with the sin issue, suffering servant. If the Jews had accepted, then he would have become the conquering king at that time. This was always part of the plan. This was part of Jesus. It was in his heart. Because the Jews didn't accept, now we've entered into this time where we are dealing spiritually with our weapons and so forth. But yes, I believe literally he's going to come back.
So could I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want you to clarify this. I want you to clarify this.
Please do.
Because I want to make sure that you are not a cult. Is this mainstream Christian belief? This is mainstream Christian belief.
No.
This is not mainstream Christian belief.
The majority of Christians that I meet do not believe the Bible literally.
Okay. So how would you address people like Jay Smith and so on? How would you approach them? And some of
The
the
same
people
way
that
I approach you, Yusuf, in love. And I would pull him close, and I would say, Jay, I don't agree with you.
That's good. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the honesty. Thank you very much for clarifying that.
All right, questions from them.
Questions?
Who's coming with the microphone? We're going to, whoever receives the question will have 3 minutes to answer, and then the other person gets 1 minute to also answer after that.
I'm Yahya, my Christian brother. I will ask you 2 questions, but they are intertwined. In your Bible, there is where Jesus Christ tells his disciples when they were in Gethsemane, I think it is in the book of Matthew, he said to them, whoever of you does not have a sword with him today, he must sell his robe and make sure that he got a sword. Am I right?
It's
so, if you say that Jesus Christ did not intend to do violence when he was about to be assassinated, why would he tell his disciples to prepare and get swords for themselves? Because to my belief, swords are used to defend one's life and meaning to kill in order to defend yourself.
Correct.
So why are you saying that Jesus Christ did not intend to do any violence whatsoever when he was on earth? That is the first question.
It's a good question.
Then the last question would be, during the time of the Crusades, Pope Urban II, He's the man who gathered the Europeans all over Europe to go and attack the Muslims there in Palestine, in Jerusalem, with the aim of capturing Jerusalem. You spoke earlier about ISIL, and most of the Christians have got a misconception that we are violent people, of which is not the case. But now, I can put it to you now that since the time of the Crusades, which became the Knights Templars, which now became the Freemasons in this era, they carry on killing the Muslims. They have got organizations like NATO, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the US. They are the continuation of the Crusades. And there is a proof that some of them even have a bloodline dating back to the time of the Crusades. So I can put it to you that the Muslims are not violent. It is as a result of those people who went to attack the Muslims in those sanctuaries, and which they carry on to do even today. So things like ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Shabaab, they came as a result of the violence that was perpetrated by the Europeans and the Americans in Muslim countries. I put it to you. I want to hear an answer from you.
I didn't hear the question in the second thing, but I will address the issue. Actually, I already did, didn't I? I addressed that very clearly in my opening remarks, that there's biblical Christianity, and then there is that false mixture where Constantine started this mixture of the empire and religion, and I believe he was biblically wrong. I would condemn what Pope Urban did with the Crusades. I think both sides in that war were wrong, to be honest with you. But that being said, just because the other guy's wrong doesn't make it right also to react in that way. I believe that the worst atrocities during the Crusades were performed not by Christians. Let's be very careful. They were people calling themselves Christians, yes, but they were Catholics. I believe that's an important distinction. Just as you would make the distinction that ISIS is not Muslim, even though they say they are. So even though somebody claims that title doesn't mean they are. We take out our final authorities and we judge them by that. And by that standard, I can clearly condemn what happened in the Crusades, and any violence that any Christian has done goes against the teachings of the New Testament. To deal with your first question, you were speaking from Luke chapter 22, and Jesus asked them, let's get it, verse 36, said unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, likewise his script. He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Well, we have to read on further. When Peter takes out his sword and takes off the right ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, Jesus rebukes Peter and tells him to put the sword away. That tells us what that sword was for. It was not for violence. It was not for fighting wars. The sword, there's two possibilities, I believe, that are legitimate, why he tells them to get swords. And bear this in mind, they answered, Lord, we have 2 swords. He said it's enough. Are 2 swords enough to fight a war? Obviously not. So it can't be buy the sword so we can go fight and be aggressive in battle. You could make the argument that it's for self-defense, because there's nothing in the New Testament that would stop us from defending ourselves if somebody's trying to physically attack us or take our property. That becomes something of this world, and we're allowed to stand up for ourselves. But the other thing is, you can use a sword for more than war. And there are cases all through where you can use it to cut down brush as you walk places. You can use it to slay an animal and eat. There are other uses for the sword. But even if you take the sword as self-defense, I believe that would match best what we're reading here. Because Jesus, when Peter used it to cut off the ear, told him to put the sword away.
Okay, yeah. I think I agree in part with most of what he said. I do believe that if the sword was used in the context of self-defense, which I believe initially it was in fact the intention of Jesus, there's no problem with that, because he does say that he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Now the word for sword in the Greek language, and correct me on this, is makai. Makai was like a sword, like a dagger, like an okapi knife. If you know what an okapi knife is, that's something what a makai was. And I would argue that the reason that Jesus asked the disciples to take swords is that they were anticipating the Jewish oligarchy coming and taking them when he went to Gethsemane, according to my interpretation. He had with him John and James, the so-called sons of thunder. These were the so-called fighting Irishmen of the day, in a manner of speaking. They were brigands in their initial time. And so he was preparing himself to overtake the Jewish oligarchy that they were anticipating. But what they had done, the Jewish oligarchy had come and they had brought who? They had brought Roman soldiers. And when they brought Roman soldiers, then Peter comes and he cuts off the ear of the high priest. Then Jesus says, put down your sword, for he that taketh the sword shall die by the sword. What he basically meant was that in that context, if you were going to continue fighting against trained and Roman soldiers of that time, his disciples were falling asleep when he was praying in Gethsemane, they would have been totally exterminated. So in that context, I believe that the strategy changed. But I do believe from my reading of the New Testament that the intention initially of Jesus was in fact to bring swords for self-defense. I don't believe the swords are spiritual, but I have no problem with that. I have absolutely no problem with that. And people like Thomas Aquinas and so on, even John Calvin, have used that in passages like that in order to justify just war theory, which I have no problem with it fundamentally. So in respect of Luke 22, when the swords were being used or called, I do believe that Jesus and his disciples were anticipating the Jewish oligarchy coming and trying to take them, and they had come with Roman swords. So accordingly, the strategy must change. But that's my interpretation of the scripture.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mutsis Musiani. I'm with the... okay. I'm at the Baptist Church in Potchefstroom. I read something interesting on the internet that's written also in the Quran. Surah 4, Ayah 50. It's interesting that you're an advocate, someone who believes in the Constitution. And let me just read what the Surah says, Quran says here.
So it's Surah 4, Ayah?
15.
15.
Yes.
I thought you said 50.
It says, those who commit immorality, that is, unlawful sexual intercourse of your woman, bring against them 4 witnesses from among you. Now, as an advocate, how would you approach, or rather, how would you allow a Muslim woman who has been under such atrocity to get justice from it?
Okay. Basically, and I think just to quote the entire verses, it says, Surah 4 verse 15, and as for those of your women who are guilty of, or an allegation is made of indecency, fornication, or immorality, then bring 4 witnesses from amongst you to testify. Now, in this particular context, what the Quran is anticipating is 4 eyewitnesses to an act of immorality. So it's not just simply as in, for example, rape cases in South Africa. In South Africa, individuals can be acquitted of rape based simply on circumstantial evidence if the state hasn't proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. In Islam, on the other hand, if an allegation is made of immorality against a woman, you have to bring 4 eyewitnesses that testified that they actually saw the act. And if under cross-examination, any of those eyewitnesses contradict, then according to the jurisprudence, according to the classic jurisprudence, if any of those 4 eyewitnesses contradict each other on their testimony, all 4 eyewitnesses receive, according to the jurisprudence, 80 lashes or 80 flogs. So that would basically mean that for anyone to come and make an allegation or testify that a woman is in fact immoral or has committed adultery or fornication, then that person has to back it up with 4 eyewitnesses, which is clearly an impossible situation. And even the testimony, even one under cross-examination bears false witness, all 4 are in fact punished according to Islamic law. And that is far more superior, because it means then that you cannot just come and willy-nilly make an allegation of chastity or immorality against women, because this was a common Arab practice. In ancient Arabian society, people were just simply accused, allegations were made, and that would be a means in terms of which they would be basically accused of fornication, accused of adultery, and a whole lot of aspects, and they were subsequently punished. But the Quran changed that rule, and it changed that law, and it made it so stringent that it made it a well-nigh impossibility for people to make allegations of slander or immorality against another person. The other point I need to make mention is that the issue of stoning. You know, we have the aspect of stoning for adulterers. Stoning is a biblical practice. Do you know in the Quran, there's absolutely nothing that says that you should stone the adulterers? Absolutely nothing. Maybe Pastor can in fact expand on it in his time. There's absolutely nothing on that particular point. Yet, that is a biblical law. And in fact, in Surah Nur, it speaks about the adulterer and the adulteress, both male and female. So it's not just a question of questioning the chastity of a female, it's a question of questioning the chastity of a male. Both male and female. It takes two to tango, not just one. And so from that perspective, I would argue, how do I reconcile it? Well, in fact, the standard is far more stringent, so you cannot just simply come, make false allegation, and bear false testimony against women. That, in fact, goes to show that the status and the integrity of a woman is protected to such an extent that if one person falsely testifies, all of them are going to be basically punished.
I don't have a lot more to add on that because this is a question strictly from the Quran. I believe he's given a very satisfactory answer on this. I will slip in something from the Bible because that's what I do. This is akin to the story in John chapter 8 of the woman taken in adultery. And the reason that Jesus was able to have mercy on her, the Jewish elders were trying to pull a fast one. They said, we caught the woman in the act of adultery, now what do you say we do? Well, if you've caught her in the act of adultery, then the law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus says both the adulterer and the adulteress need to die. If you caught her in the act, where's that other guy? Why'd you let him go? So this ties back in Deuteronomy, in the book of Numbers, you find it a couple times. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. The Quran, in this instant, takes it one step further and says you got to have 4 witnesses. So I don't know, maybe you guys learned it from us and just tried to go a little more. But I have no issues with what he's explained there.
Take the next question.
This gentleman there. That gentleman. Okay, we'll come to him. You. Okay. Go to you next.
Hi, Yusuf. Maybe I want to hear this one more time. Because way back, well, that was right after the Anglo-Boer War, I believe, when I was in grade 4. That's a long, long time ago, as you can see. I sat in the history class, and I remember that was my first, by the way, that was the first time I went to a mosque. And we had teachings about the Muslim culture. And they said, and one thing I remember, this is what I want to hear just one more time. They said, the teacher said that one of the cornerstone doctrines of the Muslim culture is to extend their territory by means of holy wars, the jihad that you discussed, I believe. So, what I understand here tonight, that is not true. Not true. Well, what is this? Yes?
The answer is it's not true.
It's not true.
That's not true.
Okay.
And I think I've given you verses in the Quran which speak about...
I believe you.
Yeah, and I think Pastor Mike agrees with me as well. But I may add one thing, just to clarify this, that Muslim armies in history have in fact engaged in expansion. They have in fact engaged in expansion, just like the Christians engage in expansions and acquisition of land and expansion of territory. But I may add this, that more often than not, it became convenient for them to cite religion or religious justification for their particular actions. For example, when Pope Urban II gave a commandment to the commanders to liberate Jerusalem, he cited Luke 19:27. Those enemies of mine that would not reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me. And so Pastor Mike will obviously argue that that's a parable or probably a future allusion to Christ and his second return. But people have used religion to expand their territory. And I think it's also, it's a disservice to history, because the world we're living in is very much different to the world 700-800 years. There was no territory as such. There was no, your country is South Africa, and then there's Zimbabwe. There were empires. There were empires fighting against empires. You had the Byzantine Christian Empire. Then you had the Islamic Empire. Then you had the Ottoman Empire. Then the Abbasids. Then the Chinese Empire. These were empires competing against each other. So to suggest or to try and superimpose that particular social-political milieu in the 21st century does basically a disservice to history. So we see that as products of history, but there's nothing in the Quran which today informs us to go take the sword or take the gun and kill people and then take over their land. There's absolutely nothing for that, and the Quran is quite clear on that point.
Is it the next question?
I think he wants to, you want to make a comment? Yes.
I'm sorry, I'll go quickly. This is actually one, I mentioned earlier that there are still questions I have about Islam and the Quran, and this is actually one of them. I'm reading from Surah 8, verse 38 and 39. Say to the unbelievers, if now they desist from unbelief, their past would be forgiven them. But if they persist, the punishment of those before them is already a matter of warning for them, meaning past wars that were fought and won by the Muslims, that should have taught these unbelievers better. Verse 39, and fight them on until there is no more tumult or oppression, and there prevail justice and faith in God altogether and everywhere. But if they cease, verily God doth see all that they do. So I'm not going to take the path of the typical Christian polemicist on this point, but I will say that what they say is, see, it says fight until everybody has faith in Allah, which makes it sound like let's proselytize by the sword. I don't think that's what it's saying. Clearly from the context, there's a war happening, somebody attacked them. If the enemy ceases, then no more fighting. I get that. My concern, though, is the limits of this. And that's why I mentioned earlier, with Israel, God gave them a piece of land and said, now here's the rules for your land. There was no idea of expansion or move. God put limits on it. And with Islam, I don't read anything in the Quran where God said to Muhammad or any of them, that's your land, these are the rules that you govern your land by. So anybody that comes, a war proceeds, and then where does it stop? Because this verse says all together and everywhere. So even though it might be a defensive war, I believe it is in this passage, I don't see the boundaries for it, which is one of my concerns that I still have about Islam and the Quran.
Could I address that? Do you want me to address that? No. Do you want me to address that? It's up to you. That's up to them. Okay, that's up to them. Do you want me to address it? He's asked it. It's up to you. It's up to, obviously, up to you. Do you want me to address what he raised? I think the question that passed... 30 seconds. The question that he's basically asked is that he sees no limitations in terms of what you have here. Absolutely no limitations in terms of the actual principle of fighting. But I did mention, and I mentioned it numerous times... Limitations for the land. Limitations for the land. But here's the problem. In Surah 60... If you look at Surah 60, because you need to juxtapose them, maybe you could read it for us so we can do this together. If you open to Surah 60, maybe this will be far more quicker if you can't do the Roman numerals. In Surah 60, verse 8, it gives a limitation. It gives a limitation to you in terms of engaging in hostilities with those who are fighting. And what's the limitation? It says here, Allah forbids you not from respecting those who fight you not for your religion, nor drive you forth from your homes, that you show them kindness and deal with them justly. Allah only forbids you from respecting those who fight you for your religion and drive you forth for your home and help in your expulsion, that you make friends of them. And whoever makes friends of them, they are the wrongdoers. There's the limitation. Can you see? That's where the limitation is. The limitation is that if you meet a community from another religious group that engages in fighting for you and wants to fight you and drive you out from your home, you fight against them. But it says here, if they do not fight against you, they do not fight against your faith, they do not drive you forth from your homes, then there's no prohibition. In fact, it's in fact an obligation that you show them kindness and deal with them justly. That would be the limitation. But you'd have to juxtapose it with the other passages in the Quran and read it holistically to come to the conclusion. Does that basically make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you.
My question was about the land. Okay. I understand your point there. So let's go to the next.
Just hold on 1 second, question responded. Pastor Mike, will you?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This many peace and blessings of Allah be upon all of us. And my question I would like to address to Pastor Mike. As you know, from your understanding of the Islamic knowledge of Islam, that Islam, even the greeting style, is about peace.
Yes.
And also, Brother Yusuf Ishmail always quoted from the Quran 67 verses encouraging peace.
Yes.
From your understanding and where you come from, don't you think this is the plan of the enemies of Islam to want to tarnish the beauty name of Islam in the likeness of ISIS, when we know what America did to Iraq, and now in Syria, and now NATO in Libya, and then they are creating these groups so that they may tarnish the beautiful name of Islam, according to understanding.
Yes. Yes, I believe that it works both ways. I believe that down through the ages, there have been many times people have used a name, whether it's Christianity or Islam, improperly, and they've done atrocities, and then it tarnishes the name. I admit that. I think it happens both ways. I think that is what ISIS is doing. I think they're making Islam look bad. Now, that being said, I'll also be quick to point out, I do not believe the Quran is inherently violent. I don't think it teaches somebody to go out and do what ISIS does. That's my understanding of the Quran. I believe Islam's a different subject. And that's why I mentioned earlier, I see different versions of Islam. So depending on which hadith they count as sahih and so forth, then it gets a bit confusing, a bit dodgy in there. But then in Christianity, so-called, we have that issue too, where people take the Bible, take certain church fathers, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and then they twist that and justify wrongdoing and wickedness. So I think both of us have to deal with that to a certain extent. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that I agree with him entirely. We both agree. I agree with this point. Next one.
My question is to the Christian brother. It's very short and concise. But I wish and I want that you will answer it comprehensively and in very clear terms. Do not make argumentation. I want you to be very clear on that point from the beginning. You have said that you believe that Jesus was God, and you will agree with me that Jesus was born at a certain time, some 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
So now, and we know that as a matter of fact, that this universe on which, or this planet on which we live, it does exist just for 2,000 years. So my question is, before the birth, the miracle birth, and I do believe as a true Muslim, the miracle birth of Jesus, who was God before the miracle birth of Jesus? I want you to answer that comprehensively in a clear-cut answer.
Thank you. I do not believe that we can limit Jesus as God to his human existence. I don't, that would be unfair. So John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which that verse can only be understood in the Trinitarian sense. The same was in the beginning with God. Moving to the end of, or to verse 14, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So I believe that God has always existed. I believe he is a Trinity. But then his human manifestation happened 2,000 years ago. So I do not want to limit God to saying he only has one manifestation, and that is his spiritual form. I think that would be wrong to limit God. With God, all things are possible. So if God wants to manifest himself in human form, he's well able to do that. I believe both of us have in our scriptures, Muslim and Christian alike, that with God, all things are possible. So I would certainly not put that beyond God's ability to manifest himself in human form. Now, if we were to say that God was doing something sinful or wrong, that's beyond God, isn't it? The limits of God are his holiness. He'll never do anything sinful or wrong. But to humble himself, take on the form of a human being, that's not contradictory to the nature or the morality or any of that of God. That's just him choosing to manifest himself in a different way at a different time. And furthermore, God is omnipresent. He's able to be in more than one place at one time. I think everybody in the room would agree with that. And therefore, it would be easy for God to be in heaven and another part of God to be on the earth at the same time, manifested in a different way. So I hope that's comprehensive enough.
Okay, I think that's another topic entirely, but just to make a quick observation, that's something which we disagree with. I may, however, quote Job chapter 25, verse 4. Maybe Pastor could deal with it. It does say in Job 25, verse 4, and here I'm preaching, how then can man be justified with God? How can man be justified with God? Or how can he, this is what Job says, how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Ye the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man that is a maggot, and the Son of Man, who is a worm. Now, when you look at the distinction that is created, the Son of Man, slightly of a higher degree, man, which is a maggot, clearly there's a distinction being basically made. Now, it's an entire debate on its own. We've never tackled this debate. We may do it in the future. Suffice to state that from a Muslim perspective, we would believe that Jesus is a man. He's a human being. He was a mighty messenger of God. If you look at John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In Greek, and Pastor he could come back and address as well. In Greek, en arche, en ho logos, kai ho logos, en pros, ton theon, kai theos, en ho logos. In other words, there's a distinction there between, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, ton theon, and the Word was God, theos. Therefore, the Unitarians and people like Dale Tuggy, and even the Jehovah's Witnesses, choose to translate the second God with a small g, based on the fact that the Logos had that divine quality amongst him, but the Logos was not Almighty God. That's my reading and my interpretation of the text. But again, it's another debate on its own. If Pastor wants to come back on that, that's fine. Okay. We'll deal with that in the future, hopefully. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening to all. Two questions to Pastor Mike.
He's got more friends than me tonight.
Okay. Firstly, as you mentioned that you see four versions of Islam, and the Islam that you read about in the Quran is actually what Islam is supposed to be.
I would think so.
In the same way, I can ask that the Christianity that you read about in the Bible, is it the same religion that you see in the world today?
Excellent question.
Secondly, my second question. Regarding the Quran, I'm sure you already looked at it. The Quran may differ in the way it is translated and the way commentaries are made upon it from place to place. But if you look at the text, it is exactly the same from cover to cover all over the world. Why is it that the Bible is of many versions and different in words and etc.?
Okay. All right. Remind me, your first question, you said that that's it. I made mention that when I read the Quran, I don't see Islam mirroring what I've read there. And yes, he's pointed out very, very aptly, very correctly. You visit my church on any given Sunday, you'll hear me pointing this out constantly. Right, folks? Amen. Okay. There's a few amens there because they know I'm preaching. Yeah. James chapter 1, verse 22. Don't deceive yourselves. Don't only be hearers, be doers of the word. We're constantly preaching that. I think that's a common problem for both of us, isn't it? Is that we find people not living up to the standard, which is why we need a Savior. But it is an issue. It is an issue. I am attempting to live my life by the Bible. I am. And I find that the more effort I put into that, the more I conform to what the Bible says and to the image of Jesus Christ, the more joy I have, the more fellowship I have with the Father, the better I get along with my brothers and sisters in Christ, the more I'm able to love Yusuf. Even Yusuf. Wow. What an amazing God we have. I love Yusuf. All right, now to your second question, the manuscript thing. There have been, this is something, Yusuf and we've chatted about this in the past. When it comes down to the manuscripts, the Bible has a lot more manuscript evidence behind it than the Quran. You can find some variations even within the Quranic manuscripts, not nearly what you find with the Bibles. I think that has to do with the amount of manuscripts. Plus, the differences you find in the Quranic material is not nearly like what you would find with the Bible. That being said, that is a large topic we're just not able to dig into too deep. A lot of the differences you find between the Bibles, it does come down to how they translate words. It also comes down to which Greek or Hebrew manuscripts they're working from. And that is why me personally, I stick to the King James Bible in English based on its purity. I realize that others, you can translate Greek words different ways and maybe come out with a different translation, still be right. But these newer versions of the Bible, they tend to lean on manuscripts recently found, and they might be older. I don't consider them better. And there's where the variants come in, and that's why I do stick to this, because it seems to be complete and whole and pure. It doesn't contain contradictions as I see it. So I hope that's a bit of an answer to you. I wish I could dig deeper, but for 3 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Next question.
Hi, this is Jonathan. Mr. Yusuf, I just want to ask, it's actually a concern. I know a lot of Muslims, and I respect you because you are so calm and nice people. And I was in Jeddah for 2 years, and I met up with the most beautiful people and Muslim people. But my concern is, there's about 1.8, you said there's 1.8 billion Muslims all around the world. And then you had you said there was a Chinese whisper of some people that will go radical. Now, there's 2% in the world that's radical. That leaves us about 4 million, or say 2 million radical Muslims, or ISIS, or what you want to call them. And now that's an army. And that's our concern. It's not the Muslims that we see and that we respect, but there's a concern. There's 4 million people. That's my concern. Can you please address that?
Okay.
Please.
I don't know how the Chinese whispers we're discussing in the context of the Hadith and the Itna. I don't know how that ties up with the issue of the militancy that you see in the world today. You may have conflated the two.
No, sorry, maybe I said it wrong. Remember that, guys, that goes out in the name of ISIS and say, okay, certain things they take up wrong.
Yeah.
And now they, sorry. Certain things that they say, that you were saying about the Quran, that some of them, they take it up wrong. No, say that's 1% of all the Muslims, and they take it up wrong. That's the whole army. That's what I was actually referring to.
Yeah, okay. Look, I would say that the statistics are not, I don't believe that there are 4 million extremists in the world today. There may be people who are ultra-conservatives, but if you're talking about the capacity of people like ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, they are not as many as up to 4 or 5 million. The other point is this, is that a lot of them don't engage in what I would call atomized reading of scripture. Because if you look at the examples that I presented in my lecture, most of the people who analyze them and study these individuals and in fact interview them and look at their background, you basically find that with most of these people it's a question of religious identity. When Didier Francois was kept in captivity with ISIS, a lot of the people that he met had absolutely no interaction with their faith. They didn't have a copy of the Quran. And so a lot of these youngsters that go, you've seen the pictures that I've shown you. A lot of them they're not religiously motivated individuals. Now there may be some individuals who perhaps hold a leadership position that may choose to atomize the scripture. Their number is even more smaller, because you've got them a few hundred at the most, leaders who basically are so-called self-appointed clerics. People like Osama bin Laden. He was not even a religious scholar, do you know that? Osama bin Laden was not a religious scholar, yet many people view him as a religious scholar. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, nobody knows his background. He just simply appeared in 2003 after the Iraqi invasion, and these people just simply pop up. What is quite fascinating is that all these individuals arise after aggressive, militant, imperial invasion. Why is that the case? Like, for example, in Cambodia. Cambodia was a peaceful land. Yet, under President Nixon and his Secretary General Henry Kissinger, they bombed Cambodia into the Stone Age. What happened? You had the rise of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge that committed atrocities that equate, if not worse, than what ISIS is doing. Iraq had absolutely no religious fundamentalist militant problem in the 80s, 70s, and the 60s. It was a secular dictatorship. After the 2003 invasion, what happens? It suddenly becomes a total catastrophe, a total anarchy. So I think we need to look at the situation. Is it also not just simply the question of the concern, but the problems that imperial power is basically engaging in? What you have, the powerful hegemonic right-wing extremist regimes, the United States government and its wars that it's been committing in many countries, foreign policy issues, a whole lot of factors that basically play to this. So to simply state that this is a problem, one thing which you and I can do is let's not empower the extremists. How do we not empower them? We do not empower them by calling them back to an authentic version of Islam. If you call them back to an authentic version of the Quran, then you immediately disempower them. It delegitimizes them entirely. And that's basically the role which we as Muslims should do. And of course, like-minded Christians like yourself, like the good people in the audience, like my good friend Pastor Mike, and of course do away with the kind of aberrations and the mutations that have basically crept into our faith.
All right, I think, speaking from the Christian point of view, we've already set an example for how to deal with this in our church history. Because as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have time to elaborate very much on it, but when you get Constantine in the 300s and moving forward, and you have this church state set up within the Roman Catholic Church and so forth, after about 1,000 years of that, a lot of Christians got sick of it. And said, we are tired of people blaming Christianity for all these horrible atrocities. And then John Wycliffe stood up and said, hey, it's time that the people started reading the Bible in their own language. No more priests preaching to us in Latin that we don't even understand. They said, we want our Bible in English. Wycliffe translated it. It completely revolutionized not only that country, but the world eventually. It led to the Reformation, to people getting back to the book. Now, you might be thinking I'm saying, well, if that's the case, then Islam needs to be out there preaching and telling these right-wing groups, come back to the Quran. Yusuf, I love you, but you know what you should do? Tell them to come back to the Bible.
Thank you very much. Is there one question there?
But the teaching, and I don't know how widespread it is, but the teaching is that the one sure way to get into heaven is to engage in violent jihad. And so it seems like what a lot of them are doing is saying, okay, well, I've done a lot of bad deeds, so if I die now I'm screwed. Therefore I better go and engage in jihad, because that's like a desperate way of me trying to get to heaven. So it seems to be what's happening, if I so I do agree with you that I don't think the product is teaching violence, but it does seem to almost be a product of the system in a way. I don't know what your views are.
Yeah, you know, that would mean looking, I think what the question is basically saying is that these people have basically lived a sinful life all their lives, and then suddenly they're engaging in a form of violent jihad as a kind of a redemption for their past sins. Now, that would mean going directly and deeply and delving into the internal motivations of the individual. And it becomes inherently problematic because when you look at these individuals that are subsequently either arrested prior or subsequent or before a terrorist act is in fact committed, they don't cite that as a justification for their particular acts of violence. So if they cited that, maybe they may have had this warped idea or notion that, look, I'm going to commit the act of violence and therefore it's going to get me a straight ticket to heaven. They don't cite this. There may be some that may possibly believe in this, I don't know. I haven't opened up their hearts and looked at their internal motivations. But more often than not, you cite and you see a case of dissatisfaction, a case of a loss of identity, and they may use Islamic terminology to justify the acts of violence. But I don't think looking at these individuals, like for example Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, or Mohammed Akhtar, the 9/11 attacker, who was purportedly found in strip clubs and so on. I don't think they believe that now this is basically a straight ticket for us to go to heaven because of our past sins. What it basically shows, for me, is that these individuals are not particularly knowledgeable about their specific faith. And that's what an analysis by psychologists, by people like Mark Stegeman, have gone on to show. That a true knowledge of your faith could never lead you to the kind of insanity that you basically see. Because there's absolutely nothing. If there was any form of scriptural justification for that, you know, the Quran does in fact speak about martyrdom and the rewards of a martyr. But there is absolutely no scriptural justification for the idea in the Quran or in the prophetic tradition that for you to cleanse yourself of your sins, you now need to go and take a machine gun and just shoot down everyone. It's totally insane. It's totally warped, it's totally perverted, and it's totally, it's basically some sort of, people may, right-wingers by the way, may promote that idea. I'm talking about the extreme right from the West. They want to promote that idea, but they will do it for their own particular agenda. But there's no scriptural basis or justification from that, from the Quranic point of view.
All right, I'm going to respond just real quick. It actually ties into why I asked about the hadith, okay, to be honest with you. Let me see if I can put a nasty spin on this. All right? There's a hadith, help me, in case I get it wrong, where Muhammad said that the entrance of paradise is underneath the shadow of the swords. Right? Okay, then I turn to Surah 9, verse 20. Those who believe and suffer exile and strive with might and main, do your best to fight, in God's cause, with their goods and their persons, have the highest rank in the sight of God. They are the people who will achieve salvation. So, I hear a hadith that says, if I want to get to paradise, I got to pass through this sword, under the shadow of the swords. Then I flip open my Quran, or I listen to some radical imam that's all hyped up on jihad and so forth, and he gives me just this verse and says, you see, the highest rank, what can achieve you salvation, according to that verse, is to strive with all your might. Now, if I left it there, I believe you would see where some people get the motivation to say, okay, I get it. Hadith says swords, paradise, this is highest rank. That's how, and it says they will achieve salvation. I put that together. If I don't have an imam or a Yusuf, they're whispering over my shoulder saying, no, don't understand it like that. I might be in trouble. So that's why I asked about the hadith. Yeah, please respond.
I think the point, just open it.
Oh, sorry.
I think the point he was asking, which is something subsequently different to what's contained in the Quranic verse. Both from the Christian and the Muslim perspective, we have a high regard for martyrs. Do we agree? This is in Christianity, there's a high regard for martyrs. In Islam also there's a high regard for martyrs. So as it says, those who believe and suffer exile, they suffer exile. How do you suffer exile? Do you suffer exile by going to a strip club, by basically engaging in alcoholic consumption, engaging in drug taking, visiting prostitutes? So it cannot basically refer to people who are engaging in the vices, the worst vices of society, and then kill people, and then basically believe they're going to heaven. So it says here categorically, those who believe. So those people were not really believing and they're engaging in vices. And then it says, suffer exile. You can't suffer exile by visiting hookers and taking drugs and drinking alcohol, and strive with might and main. In that context, in God's cause, would their goods and their persons have the highest rank in the sight of God? There are people who will achieve salvation. And we have there's no apology we make for this. That martyrdom, a person who suffers and strives in the might, in the path of God, in any way, physically, psychologically, emotionally, will have the highest sight in God. And if he's killed in that process and martyred, he basically has the highest rank in paradise. But nowhere can you see in this verse any form of justification. And I just read it, exactly what he read. Can you see any justification that a person now believes, based on reading this verse, that I can go tomorrow, go to a strip club, drink alcohol, take drugs, and then I go and shoot a whole lot of people in the shebeen, and somehow I'm getting a free ticket to heaven? You can't reach that conclusion based on reading this particular verse. I do believe the fact that martyrdom has a high position in Islam. Martyrdom also has a high position in Christianity. And so that should not be confused by people who engage in acts of violence and want to then be equated with martyrs. That's where the distinction should be made.
Let me jump back in, because remember what I said when I started to explain this. I told you up front I'm going to put a nasty spin on it, right? I told you that because I'm aware of how the verses get abused. You know why? For almost 2,000 years, people have been doing it to the Christian Bible as well. So I get it that people do it to the Quran. That's not fair. Equal scales. So that's why I told you, nasty spin. Martyrdom, we do. We hold in high esteem. There is a slight difference. Within Islam, they go out and fight these battles, justifiable, if even so. But then somebody dies in this physical battle. Whereas with the Christian, we consider martyrdom somebody who is out there preaching the gospel and gets persecuted for it. He is not engaged in violence. But that being said, I still agree we hold them both in high esteem. So.
The Calvinists may disagree with you.
And that's fine. We'll debate them next.
Okay. You know I'm supposed to be a chairman, but Pastor, even in Islam, if a person stands for justice, all he has to do is agree with a tyrant, and he will be accepted. And if he disagrees on a just matter, and he's persecuted and killed, he's a martyr.
I didn't understand.
I think what he's saying basically is that you've got the just war theory in Islam, where a person, for example, fights in a just war, a defensive war in the Quran, and is killed. That's a martyr. But at the same time, you've got a person who, for example, in a solitary sense, stands up and challenges, for example, unjust laws or speaks truth to an oppressive leader, and therefore is persecuted, imprisoned, tortured to death. That's also martyr. So martyrdom is basically all-inclusive. It deals with fighting in battle, in a legitimate battle, not just any belligerent battle, and of course dying in a normal pacifist context that belongs to.
I understand. But what you were explaining was one form of martyrdom. I just wanted to point out.
So Islam incorporates two forms of martyrdoms. I would argue that Pastor Mike and his interpretation will incorporate one form of martyrdom. The Lutherans and the Calvinists, they have a different interpretation as well. Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have the last question now.
Good evening, Pastor. Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf, and all the guests. I think, first of all, the current situation that we experience, a little comment before I actually start the comment, and I'd like to just say something to the question of the gentleman, on the question of the gentleman there. The current situation needs to be understood within context of, or within its historical context, and the ignorance that Brother Yusuf has made reference to when he spoke about the people that are exploited for the agenda of those who wish to fight certain wars, needs to be understood, and we need to ask, why are those people actually ignorant of their religion? And I think the answer to that finds itself in the removal of people from their religion because of historical, political reasons, colonization, and what went with it. So we find people that have been removed from their culture, removed from their religion, transplanted within another culture, and they've been stripped of their identity. They try to find roads back to their culture, and they're unfortunate to fall into the hands of people that exploit them, and that is quite often what is happening in the West. The only way to counter that is, like you people referred to before, and that is to spread the good, positive interpretation of Islam. What I would like to say with regards to the gentleman's question, if you allow me to. Jihad is secular, and we have the Crusades. I know you deny the legitimacy of the Crusade war, but it's a part of Christianity. And jihad is a part of Islam, definitely, and we don't deny that. But what happened is Muslims went to preach, and they requested, they went and sought permission from the authorities to convey the message. If they were denied access to convey the message, they went in and so they first sought permission to convey the message. When they were denied to convey the message, denied permission to convey, they went out onto the land and started conveying the message. If they were prohibited, obviously forcefully, they then retaliated with force, and that was how jihad was fought initially. What we see now is no form of jihad. I've got two questions. The first is with regards to the gospel of the Bible. It's a fact of history that Christianity was used by the Roman Empire to further certain agendas. Okay. It's a fact that the gospel, the text of the gospel was manipulated to suit certain agendas. Question is, where is the original text of the Bible? Two is, the current text that we have, which is referred to as the Bible, is recollections, as what was referred to almost compared to the Hadith. And that is what we see the Bible as being today. A lot of meaning was also lost in its translation from Hebrew to Latin, and from Latin to the various languages that we use today. So I know you made mention of you preferring to use a certain Bible, or a version of the Bible for certain reasons, and that goes back to a word you used where you said, it seems to be, to you, the most authoritative copy of the Bible today. And that is a problem for me, because it goes back to the opinion of a person as to what is authoritative and not, and will always be challenged, and definitely is challenged in the Christian, larger Christian religion. The second question that I'd like to pose is that we see a clear chain of prophets from the creation of Adam. And we all believe that this is something common between the three faiths of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. that we all believe in the prophets, starting from Adam and Enoch and up and up and up until we have Abraham, the children of Abraham. The Jews believe until Moses and deny the prophethood of Jesus. The Christians, on the other hand, accept Jesus and deny the prophethood of Muhammad. Why is it that we agreed on everything before, but we haven't agreed on the finality of Muhammad? If we look at the two religions and how close they are in many aspects, we can see how they overlap one another. Yet, there's two things that differentiate a Muslim from a Christian in essence. And that is, the first is that Jesus is regarded as the Son of God, and not just a prophet. We accept Jesus as being a prophet. We speak of Mary, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to Mary. But the finality of prophethood of Muhammad is denied by Christians. And the second thing,
I think just to be fair to the pastor, I think you got the questions. Yeah, I think basically the issues are the aspect of the Gospels. That will be the last question, as I understand. Okay.
Right. I had a quote from Shabir Ali to this extent, where he mentioned that both Islam and Christianity, we don't have access to the original manuscripts for either of our books. So you have to judge the matter based on what we do have left. And when I mentioned earlier, and I did, and it seems to me the King James Version is the most reliable and authoritative version. I am convinced of that, not because I just like it, but I have studied it and compared it with the others. Thank you for the segue, another advertisement. Be sure to grab one of those books over yonder that we brought. That was the purpose of that book, actually, is to show why we rely on the Bible, why I don't see contradictions in it, even though many have been supposed and brought up. So I admit, to answer your first question, where are the original biblical manuscripts? We don't have them. But think of this, folks. How would you know you found them if you found them? Do you think Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, any of them wrote the epistle and stamped on it original? We would, even if you found it, you wouldn't know you found it. So God never promised in the Bible that He would preserve the original manuscripts. What He did promise is that He would preserve His words and preserve His knowledge, and I believe He can do that in any language He so desires. So I believe that addresses the first one. The second one, why do we not accept Muhammad and his prophethood as a continuation? That's actually a lengthy answer, but I'll try to condense it and just say this. I don't see Muhammad as confirming what came before. So what I read with Moses, Jesus, the other prophets, when I read the Bible, I don't see it consistent with what we read in the Quran. So certain things that Muhammad said contradict what we find in the Bible. My personal opinion of this is when he wrote the Quran, or when he recited the Quran, let's say it like that, that's truthful, he was not aware that he was contradicting the Bible. He thought everything lined up. But then years later, when people begin to investigate, oh my goodness, it doesn't line up, and then this teaching of, well, the Bible must be corrupted because Muhammad can't be wrong. And I think that crept in a little later. But that's why one of the reasons I don't take Muhammad as the continuation of those prophets. I just don't see him being consistent with what came before him.
Thank you, it's a good question. I'm not going to delve into the issue of scriptural offense. That's a debate next on. I would like to address it at some later stage. Just quickly on the point. In the Quran, in Surah 61, verse 6, you read the passage, and when Jesus, the son of Mary, said, O children of Israel, surely I am the messenger of God, to you verifying that which is before me of the Torah, and giving good news of a messenger who will come after me, whose name shall be Ahmed. And that's contained in the Quran. There was a future prophecy about Jesus, about a man who is a praised one. Now, do we find something like this in the New Testament? Some scholars argue that if you look at John chapter 16, verse 12 to 14, regarding the Spirit of truth, basically you hear the expression where Jesus says, I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Meaning, God had given Jesus guidance to guide mankind till doomsday, but the people were not fit to receive the message. So he says, I have yet many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth shall come, He will guide you unto all truth. For He shall not speak from Himself, but what things ever shall He hear, that shall He speak, and He shall declare unto you the things that are to come. He shall glorify me. And John uses the term spirit and prophet interchangeably, because if you look at 1 John chapter 4 verse 1, it says, "Beloved believers, not every spirit, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." In other words, a true spirit is a true prophet and a false spirit is a false prophet. How do you determine whether a spirit or prophet is of true from God? He says, every spirit that confesses that Jesus is the Christ is of God. And Islam is the only non-Christian faith that makes it an article of faith for followers to believe in Jesus. So if you use that angle and analogy, we could argue that from the perspective of the New Testament, that comforter, that spirit of truth, you are having 6 masculine pronouns in a single verse, it ill befits a spirit. It refers to someone that is to come after Christ. And so I'd leave you with that. I know you may have a response to that.
I'm jumping back in. Because you jumped on one, I'm jumping in.
Okay.
When he mentions the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, John 14, very quickly, he says,
the Comforter is the Holy Spirit. It does define that.
I'll pray the Father, shall give you another Comforter, may abide with you forever. So he's still here.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't fit Muhammad. Even the Spirit of Truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it seeth him not. They saw Muhammad, but you can't see the Spirit of Truth. Neither knoweth him, but ye know him, for he dwelleth with you, and shall be in you. Muhammad cannot live within, but the Holy Spirit could. The thing in 1 John chapter 4, believe not every spirit, try the spirits.
Because many false prophets.
Many false prophets. It's because the false prophets have an unclean spirit in them. The reason they're preaching falsehood is because they've been led wrong by
John does use spirit and prophet. But we can debate that in
we'll talk about that another time.
But I want to take this liberty, not going to preach. I want to thank Pastor Mike, since you've been our guest. I want to thank all of you for attending. I think it's important we have sessions like this. We're going to reciprocate. I'm going to visit your congregation soon. We love to see you all here. As you can see, you are our friends. We are brothers and sisters, not necessarily in faith, but in humanity. And as part of our tradition, Pastor Mike already saw his here, but I want to take this opportunity to give him this beautifully bound Quran. I'm not going to tell you the price of it, but it's probably one of the best translations you will find by Muhammad Asad, an Austrian-German Jew, formerly called Leopold Weiss. He wrote for the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1921. He died in 1992. It's a gift. I don't even own a copy that is bound in this particular fashion, but I'm going to hand you a copy in friendship with his life. Thank you very much.
Pastor Mike, thank you very, very much. It's always a pleasure seeing you, and we really appreciate your traveling so far. So everybody, can you give the two speakers a hand of applause? Once again, thank you very, very much.